There exists, in the archival depths of the Vatican, a single ledger from the year 1492. On its yellowed pages, the amounts are listed in meticulous Latin notation, precise, categorical, undeniable. They represent payments made in gold, in property, in benefices and ecclesiastical offices, all exchanged not for military conquest or trade goods, but for the highest office in Christendom. The papal tiara itself was, in that moment, openly for sale, and one family knew exactly how much to pay. This is the beginning of perhaps the most audacious corruption in the history of institutional power, not hidden behind metaphor or diplomatic language, but naked and documented, as if written in permanent ink upon history's most sacred and public page. The name of that family was Borgia, and their ascent from provincial Spanish nobility to the very heart of Rome's spiritual authority represents something stranger than simple wickedness. It shows us how a system designed to prevent corruption can become, over time, a mechanism that rewards it. If you've ever wondered how power actually consolidates in the shadows of great institutions, or how a family with no claim to legitimacy can remake the entire structure around themselves, you'll want to subscribe now, so you can follow the complete arc of the Borgia story, from their first ambitious gamble to their inevitable and spectacular fall. This is a journey through Renaissance corruption, strategic marriage, moral ambiguity, and the slow discovery that no dynasty, however carefully constructed, outlasts the moment when everyone stops believing in it. Subscribe for the full chronology of their rise and ruin. Now, imagine yourself in Rome in the closing years of the 15th century. Not the Rome of the guidebook or the crowded piazza, but the Rome that existed after nightfall, when the city retreated behind closed doors and the torchlight made the ancient stones seem older still. The corridors of the Vatican at night possess a particular quality, a thickness to the air, a sense of accumulated centuries pressing down from the vaulted ceilings. The flames from the iron torches mounted along the walls cast moving shadows across walls of pale travertine and dark red brick, walls that have stood for generations beyond counting. The light flickers and steadies, in a rhythm that feels almost like breathing, and threading through this luminous darkness is a scent that would have been instantly recognizable to anyone who walked these hallways, the warm, dense smell of beeswax candles, layered beneath it the sharp clarity of iron and stone, and underneath that, something more delicate, the scent of ink, of parchment, of documents being transcribed by candlelight in cramped scriptoriums deep within the palace walls. The torches illuminate faces of marble saints set into alcoves, stern, watchful, their stone eyes following the movement of the living. Somewhere in the building, a bell tolls the hour. The sound carries through corridors lined with centuries of decisions, alliances brokered, excommunications pronounced, the fate of kingdoms discussed in whispers by men whose names are now forgotten. This is the world into which our story enters, not with fanfare, but with the small sound of a door opening, of footsteps echoing on stone floors, of men in crimson robes moving through candle-lit passages, with the particular certainty of those who know they belong here, who have earned their place through cunning and patience, and the strategic deployment of blood relations. The Vatican in this period was not yet the immaculate sanctuary it would later become, at least not in the minds of its inhabitants. It was instead something more fluid, more human, more explicitly a place where desire and power moved through the same corridors as prayer and theology. The distinction between the sacred and the commercial, which we in later centuries have been taught to maintain with great firmness, was permeable here. Money was sacred. Power was sacred. The accumulation of both through leverage and influence was not considered contrary to spiritual purpose. It was considered its inevitable expression. And it was into this world, to this particular moment in history, when such things could be discussed openly without shame, that a family from Spain arrived with a clear and audacious plan. They were not the first to purchase their way into prominence. The Church had been functioning on such principles for generations. But they approached the task with uncommon directness, uncommon boldness, and an uncommon willingness to place every daughter and every son into service of a single, unified ambition, to plant themselves so firmly at Rome's centre that no power in the Italian peninsula could move without their knowledge or consent. Consider the psychology of such an undertaking: to leave your homeland, to abandon your local connections and regional prominence, knowing that you possess neither the ancient blood, nor the military capacity, nor the naval power of the great established families, to arrive in a foreign city, in a foreign state, and to declare through your every action and transaction that you will become not merely prominent, but supreme. It requires a particular kind of certainty, a certainty that borders on madness, or perhaps flowers into brilliance, depending entirely on how events transpire. The choice of instrument is crucial. The family might have pursued secular power, accumulated land, raised armies, made strategic marriages as so many other ambitious clans had done. Instead, they chose the Church. They chose the one institution whose power transcended borders, whose authority derived not from castles or gold reserves, but from the spiritual consent of millions of believers across the continent. They chose, in essence, to hijack the mechanism of salvation itself and convert it into a machine for their own advancement. This is where our journey truly begins, not with triumph, but with arrival, not with the moment of greatest power, but with the moment when a family from the periphery first glimpsed the center and began calculating how to reach it. And there, in those corridors where whispers could topple empires, the Borgia story begins not with fanfare, but with patience, with careful steps taken by men who understood that power moves slowly, like wine poured from a height, gathering force only when it reaches its destination. This is not a tale that resolves itself quickly. It spans continents and decades. It involves cardinals and kings, poison and politics, love and the consequences of ambition played out across the marble floors of Renaissance palaces and the shrouded chambers where popes lay dying. If you find yourself drawn to these shadowed corners of history, to the untangling of reputation from reality, to the slow unfolding of how one family rose from relative obscurity to command the Church itself, then perhaps you might consider joining us as we follow the Borgias not just to their heights, but all the way through their descent. Because the true story, the one that historians still debate in hushed tones over candle-lit tables, lies not in the moment of triumph, but in what came after. It lies in the details that fade, in the moments that blur between fact and legend, in the way a family can shake Christendom and then vanish so completely that centuries later we still cannot quite agree on who they truly were. Each chapter of this dynasty unfolds like a painting revealed inch by inch, first the outline, then the shadows, then the colors that make you question what you thought you saw. There are courtesans and cardinals, children betrothed to princes they will never meet, and choices made in rooms where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. There are deaths that no one quite explains, alliances forged with signatures written in what many swore was something far more sinister than ink. There are women whose names became synonymous with scandal, whose reputations were written by enemies, and whose true lives we are only now beginning to recover from, beneath centuries of deliberate distortion. The Renaissance, you see, was not kind to those it deemed dangerous, and the Borgias were, by any measure, extraordinarily dangerous, not always in the ways their contemporaries claimed, not always with poison or daggers, though the whispers of both followed them like shadows they could never quite escape. But dangerous because they understood something fundamental about power that most families took generations to learn, that in the Church of Rome, faith and finances were intertwined like lovers, that a cardinal's hat could be bought with the right combination of gold and promises, and that once you had purchased your way into the inner sanctum, you could reshape the world according to your will. What draws scholars back to them again and again is not certainty but mystery. It is the gap between what was documented and what was believed, between the official histories and the whispered accounts, between the elaborate defenses mounted by their defenders and the lurid accusations of their detractors. We know they rose, we know they fell, but the precise mechanisms of their rise, the extent of their corruption, the truth beneath the layers of legend, these remain contested even now, 500 years later, when you might think the dust would have long since settled. Perhaps that is why their story calls to us across the centuries, why we return to it again and again, because they represent something we recognize in ourselves, the human capacity for reinvention, for ambition, for the willingness to bend rules we ourselves helped create. They show us what happens when the highest office in Christendom becomes, for a moment, the prize in a game played for stakes of gold and family honor. They show us how quickly circumstance can elevate the ordinary into the extraordinary, how a Spanish family of modest means could, in the space of a generation, command the allegiance of monarchs. As you settle deeper into this history, you will find yourself walking through Rome as it was in those days, not the Rome of tourists and guidebooks, but the Rome of shadowed dealings, of corridors that connected the papal palace to the homes of cardinals, of gardens where negotiations took place beneath flowering vines. You will encounter people whose names appear in contemporary records with different spellings, different titles, different accounts of what they actually did, and you will begin to understand that the Borgia story is not a simple tale of right and wrong, but rather a complex negotiation between power and morality, between the ideals the Church proclaimed and the practices it permitted. The invitation, then, is to walk this path with us, not as observers standing safely outside the narrative, but as travelers moving through time with someone who has traced these footsteps before, who understands the geography of these mysteries, who can show you where the documentation ends and the speculation begins. Because to truly understand the Borgias is to understand something about power itself, about how institutions corrupt, about how families sacrifice individuals for collective ambition, and about how the stories we tell about the past are never quite the same as what actually occurred. Come with us, then, into the waning days of the 15th century, to a Spain where a minor noble family was beginning to turn its eyes toward Rome, toward the greatest prize Christendom had to offer. Come to understand how one man's ambition could reshape the landscape of European politics, how nepotism became not a vice but a system of governance, how the papacy itself became a commodity to be bought and sold by those wealthy and ruthless enough to afford it. The Borgias are waiting in those corridors of candlelight, and their story unfolds most perfectly in the quiet hours, when all else has fallen away and you have time to simply listen, to wonder, to consider what it all might mean. Our story, though, does not begin in the marble halls of Rome. It begins in the warm, dusty light of eastern Spain, in a place called Sativa, a town perched on a hillside in the Kingdom of Aragon, where the sea breeze carries the salt smell of the Mediterranean, and the scent of orange blossoms drifts through narrow streets of pale stone. Here, in this corner of Iberia where Christian and Muslim worlds had only recently stopped bleeding into one another, a family was quietly building something that would eventually reach across the sea, across kingdoms and mountains, to the very heart of Christendom itself. The Borgias, or as they were known in their Spanish homeland, the Borgias, were not always men of supreme power. They were, in the early 15th century, what we might call minor nobility, landowners of respectable standing, but without the immense prestige or ancient lineage of the great European dynasties. Their origins are somewhat obscure, as origins often are when they are modest and practical rather than legendary. But what we do know is that by the time the century had turned its midpoint, the family had begun to understand something crucial about the medieval world: that the church was not merely a spiritual authority, but a repository of unimaginable wealth, power, and patronage, and that a family willing to cultivate careful relationships with the right people could rise from minor nobility into something far greater. The man who first understood this with clarity and ambition was named Alfonso de Borja. Born around the year 1377, Alphonse was the product of a particular moment in Spanish history, an era when the Reconquista, the long struggle to reclaim Christian lands from Islamic rule, was drawing toward its close, when new opportunities were opening for families who could position themselves advantageously. His father was a knight of moderate fortune. His mother came from respectable stock. There was nothing in his birth that suggested he would one day become one of the most influential men in Christendom. But Alphonse possessed something that could not be inherited: an extraordinary capacity for navigation, for understanding not just the explicit rules of a world, but the unwritten patterns that governed how power actually flowed. He educated himself in law, a choice that reveals something about his thinking. Law, in the medieval world, was not simply a matter of local custom or royal decree. Ecclesiastical law, the law of the church, was as vast and intricate as any kingdom's code, and to master it was to possess a kind of linguistic fluency in the language of institutional power. Alphonse became a doctor of canon law, a credential that opened doors. It meant he could negotiate with bishops, advise nobles on matters of inheritance and legitimacy, and most importantly, it meant he could serve the church itself in an administrative capacity. And serving the church was, for an ambitious man of middling birth, one of the most direct paths upward. What does it tell us that Alfonso de Borja, a man of no extraordinary connection or vast inherited estate, decided to stake his future on mastering the law of Rome rather than accumulating land or military power in his native Spain? Perhaps it suggests something about the structure of power itself in that era. Perhaps it whispers that by the 15th century, the church had become less an institution purely devoted to spiritual care and more a vast bureaucratic organism that resembled in many ways a secular government. It had armies, territorial holdings, treasuries, and an administrative apparatus that required thousands of educated men to maintain. And those men could become remarkably powerful indeed. By the middle of the 1400s, Alphonse had begun to rise in ecclesiastical circles. He served as an ambassador, a diplomat, a voice in the ears of those who held power. And then, in the year 1455, something remarkable happened. Alfonso de Borja was elected pope. He took the name Callixtus III, and at the moment of his election, his family's trajectory altered fundamentally and irreversibly. A man of modest Spanish provincial origins now sat at the head of the Christian Church. The Holy See itself belonged to the Borgias. But Callixtus III, as we might imagine, did not see his election as a personal triumph to be enjoyed in solitude. He saw it as an opportunity, a responsibility perhaps, if we are generous in our interpretation, to ensure that his family members shared in the fruits of his success and the doors that his position had opened. This impulse, this understanding that papal power could be used to advance one's relatives, would echo through the entire trajectory of the Borgia story. It is, in a very real sense, the seed from which everything that follows will grow. The beneficiary of this paternal conviction was Alfonso's nephew, a young man named Rodrigo Borgia, who was at that time in his mid-20s, educated, ambitious, and waiting for the moment when the doors of the church would open sufficiently wide to admit him. With his uncle's elevation to the papacy came Rodrigo's rapid ascent through the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Within months of Callixtus's election, the young Rodrigo, a man with no greater claim to office than his family name and his uncle's newfound authority, was appointed a cardinal. One might say he was handed the scarlet hat, as one might hand a son a key to his inheritance. One might also say that this moment, more than any other single event, planted within the church the seeds of the corruption and worldliness that would later haunt it, that would eventually, decades hence, help splinter Christendom itself. What were the thoughts of those who witnessed this? The cardinals and bishops who saw this young man, still untested in the ways of power, elevated so swiftly to their ranks through nothing but blood relation and papal favour? We cannot know with certainty, but we can imagine that some watched with approval, seeing in it the natural order of patronage and family loyalty that governed all medieval institutions. Others, perhaps, watched with the quiet knowledge that they were witnessing something more troubling, the transformation of sacred office into a commodity, the conversion of spiritual authority into personal wealth and dynastic advantage. But if they protested, their protests are largely lost to us now, buried beneath centuries of subsequent events, each more dramatic than the last. Rodrigo was young, he was well educated, he was connected now, through his uncle, to the very summit of Christian authority, and most importantly, he was the beginning of something new. He was the first Borgia to benefit from the family's entry into the orbit of absolute ecclesiastical power, but he would not be the last. His appointment was not an ending, but a beginning. It was the opening move in what would become a decades-long ascent of the Borgia family through the ranks of the church, an ascent built on patronage, strategic marriages, careful alliances, and an understanding, unusual for the time perhaps, but not unprecedented, that the church's vast wealth and power could be wielded like any other dynastic inheritance, passed down and leveraged and invested in the future of one's family. And so we see how it began, not with a dramatic coup or a military conquest, but with a man named Alfonso de Borja, who learned to read the law, who positioned himself carefully, who rose through merit and opportunity, and who, when fortune smiled upon him at last, used his position to pull his nephew up after him. From Zartova to Rome, from minor Spanish nobility to the College of Cardinals, from the margins of power to its very centre, the Borgias had begun their remarkable journey, and they had only just started to climb. From that small Spanish town, from the provincial obscurity of the Aragonese borderlands, a man named Alfonso de Borja would undertake a journey that would reshape not merely his own bloodline, but the very architecture of ambition within the church itself. He was born into minor nobility, the kind of family whose name carried weight only within their immediate region, whose fortunes rose and fell with the marriages they brokered and the alliances they cultivated. But Alphonse possessed something that many among the provincial gentry did not, an intellect sharp enough to be honed, and the patience required to let it be refined. He studied law, canon law, primarily, that intricate and labyrinthine discipline that governed not earthly kingdoms but the spiritual body of Christendom. In the universities of his age, canon law was not merely an academic pursuit. It was a passkey. It was the language in which power would be negotiated, in which kingdoms and the church would eventually speak to one another across the tilting landscape of Renaissance politics. Alphonse learned this language fluently. He became, by all accounts, not merely competent but exceptional, the kind of legal mind that catches the attention of those who need such minds to advance their own schemes. His talents did not go unnoticed. By the middle of the 15th century, Alfonso de Borja had begun to rise through the ecclesiastical ranks, position following position, each one requiring him to move further from home, further into the great machinery of the Church that still, at that time, radiated outward from Rome. He served as a bishop, then as a cardinal. Each step was methodical, measured, the ascent of a man who understood that haste could undo years of careful cultivation, and with each elevation, his family back in Sativa, that distant town in Valencia, understood that they were now connected to power itself. They were connected to Rome. It was in 1455 that Alfonso de Borja was elected pope. He took the name Callixtus III, and in that moment, a family of provincial Spanish nobility suddenly possessed access to the greatest concentration of wealth and influence in Christendom. The papacy in the 15th century was not a merely spiritual office. It was the headship of a sprawling temporal kingdom, the Papal States, territories of land and cities and fortresses that stretched across the Italian peninsula. It was a position that controlled vast revenues. It distributed benefices, the church offices that provided income and status to their holders. It commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and shaped the religious life of all Catholic Europe. And what did Callixtus III do with this immense authority, now that he possessed it? What he had been conditioned to do, perhaps, what many men of his generation and ambition did. He elevated his nephew, a young man named Rodrigo Borgia, who was not yet even 30 years old, was brought to Rome, and in the manner that would become the hallmark of papal nepotism in that century, Rodrigo was lifted swiftly into the highest echelons of the Church. He was made a cardinal, not through any demonstrated piety, not through any particular scholarly achievement or spiritual calling that we know of, but because he was the nephew of the Pope, because he was family, because in the world of papal power, family was the coin that purchased everything. This elevation of Rodrigo by his uncle Callixtus was not, strictly speaking, unusual. Nepotism, the preferential elevation of relatives regardless of merit, was not a scandal in the papacy of this era. It was, rather, understood to be the natural order of things. A pope was expected to favor his relatives. Family was the only institution a pope could truly trust, the only loyalty that preceded all others. And yet there was something particular in the case of Rodrigo's elevation that would ripple forward through the decades to come. Callixtus was not merely placing a young relative in a comfortable position. He was seeding something, a dynasty perhaps, or the foundation of one. He was making a choice, perhaps deliberately, to transform his family from provincial Spanish nobility into players on the greatest stage of Christendom. Rodrigo was young. He was, by the accounts that have survived, handsome in a manner that the chroniclers of the time noted and remembered. He was ambitious in ways that his uncle perhaps recognized in himself, and he possessed, already, the kind of calculating intellect that would later define the Borgia reputation. But in 1455, when he arrived in Rome as a cardinal, at the behest of his uncle the Pope, he was still largely unformed. He was still a canvas onto which the corridors of power would paint their lessons. The papacy of Callixtus III itself is remembered today, when it is remembered at all, as relatively brief. He served for only 6 years, but in those 6 years he demonstrated the central preoccupation of his pontificate, the funding and organizing of crusades against the Ottoman Turk, who had conquered Constantinople only 2 years before Callixtus's election. He devoted enormous resources to this cause, viewing it as the paramount spiritual and military necessity of his age. He was not entirely wrong, though history would render his crusades futile. But while his uncle was occupied with distant military campaigns and grand theological imperatives, Rodrigo was learning Rome. He was learning the mechanisms by which the Church distributed its wealth. He was learning the names and faces of the men who held power. He was learning which alliances to cultivate and which rivals to approach with caution. He was, in short, being educated in the practical mechanics of power by proximity to it. And then, in 1458, Pope Callixtus III died. He had served only those 6 years. He was succeeded by other popes, men unrelated to the Borgias, men who represented different factions and interests within the College of Cardinals. One might have expected that with their patron's death, the Borgia fortunes would dim. One might have expected that Rodrigo, a young cardinal from a Spanish family, would fall back into relative obscurity. But he did not. Instead, he remained. He endured. And in the decades that followed, by means that combined intelligence, charm, political acuity, and an almost serpentine understanding of how favor and obligation functioned within the Church, Rodrigo Borgia would consolidate and expand the position that his uncle Callixtus had founded. The seed that Callixtus planted, in other words, had taken root. It would grow in ways that perhaps even he could not have predicted, in ways that would eventually challenge and reshape the very nature of papal power itself. But that growth was still ahead. For now, in the years immediately following Callixtus's death, Rodrigo was simply a young cardinal with excellent connections, with Spanish backing, and with the kind of ambition that the Church, with all its ironies and contradictions, had always known how to cultivate and reward. When young Rodrigo first arrived in Rome, he was not yet the man who would wear the fisherman's ring. He was a boy of perhaps 14 or 15, sent northward from the Spanish kingdoms by his uncle Alphonse, who had only recently himself ascended to the chair of St. Peter. The transition from the sun-baked landscape of Chativa to the labyrinthine streets of Renaissance Rome must have felt like crossing between two worlds entirely, from the periphery of Christendom's power into its very heart, where marble and ambition pressed against one another in the narrow shadow of the Tiber. What we know of Rodrigo's education comes to us in fragments, like scattered tiles from a fallen mosaic. He studied canon law and civil law, the twin disciplines that governed the medieval church, acquiring not merely knowledge, but fluency in the language of ecclesiastical authority. Bologna was likely among the universities he attended, perhaps also Padua, those great centers of legal learning where the sons of ambitious families went to acquire the credentials that would serve them in the intricate machinery of Roman administration. The law was not, in his hands, merely an abstract thing. It was a tool, the very means by which the Church conducted its business, adjudicated its disputes, and consolidated its temporal power alongside its spiritual claims. His uncle watched him with the careful eye of a man planting a garden he might never fully tend. Alfonso de Borja, now elevated to the name Callixtus III, had tasted the heights of ecclesiastical authority, and he understood something that many in Rome perhaps underestimated, that the papacy was not a timeless institution floating above the world, but rather a family enterprise, and families, like vineyards, required careful pruning and generous feeding to flourish across generations. Rodrigo was being groomed, slowly and methodically, for something greater than the ordinary clergy could hope to achieve. He was being shaped into an instrument of Borgia influence. In 1456, when Rodrigo was merely 25 years of age, his uncle elevated him to the rank of cardinal. The speed of this ascension would have seemed, to any observer watching from the outer circles of Roman society, almost vertiginous. Young men did not simply leap into the College of Cardinals, that exclusive assembly of princes of the Church who elected popes and governed dioceses. And yet here was Rodrigo, scarce more than a man, sudden bearing the scarlet biretta and the title of cardinal, bestowed by blood and proximity, rather than by decades of pious service or scholarly renown. The formal justification, of course, was that he was eminently qualified, learned in the law, of noble birth, and devoted to the Church's interests. All of this was true, after a fashion, but the deeper truth, the one that circulated in the whispered conversations of the older cardinals and in the careful Latin of diplomatic correspondence, was simpler and more naked. Alphonse loved his nephew, and he had the authority to make him great. The College of Cardinals in the mid-15th century was not an institution that prided itself on meritocratic purity. Nepotism was so woven into its fabric that to separate the practice from the institution itself would be to unravel the whole thing. Popes had elevated nephews, cousins, and bastard sons for centuries. It was understood, accepted, even expected that a pontiff would use his authority to elevate his family and secure their fortunes. Yet there was still a species of decorum involved, a sense that one ought to wait a reasonable interval, ought to gesture toward qualification and fitness. Alphonse, perhaps because he was elderly, perhaps because his time was short, and he wished to see his family secure before he died, moved with unusual haste and transparency. The position itself, however, was not merely ceremonial or honorary, though it certainly conferred immense honor and wealth. A cardinal received revenues from benefices and properties across Christendom. A cardinal had a voice in the governance of the Church Universal. A cardinal, crucially, would vote in the conclave when the next pope was to be chosen. And so Rodrigo, at 25, found himself not only elevated, but positioned. His uncle was aging, and both men knew it. Callixtus III would die within 3 years of Rodrigo's elevation. But in those 3 years, Rodrigo would consolidate his position, expand his networks, and begin the process of transforming himself from the nephew of a pope into a cardinal of genuine power. What emerged during this early phase of his cardinalate was not yet the Rodrigo Borgia of legend, not yet the man whose name would become synonymous with Renaissance corruption and worldly ambition. Rather, it was a careful, calculating figure, educated, fluent in the languages of law and diplomacy, attentive to the details of administrative power. He was learning the topology of the curia, the intricate dance of favors and obligations, the way that land and money and titles flowed through the ecclesiastical hierarchy like invisible currents in a river. One wonders, in the quietness of such historical contemplation, what young Rodrigo felt as he received his cardinal's hat. Pride, certainly, gratification at his uncle's faith in him, but perhaps also the weight of expectation, the understanding that he was now bound into a system of reciprocal obligation that extended far beyond his own ambitions. He was a Borgia, elevated through Borgia connections, entrusted with Borgia interests. The family's future was, in some real sense, now his responsibility. The years following his elevation saw Rodrigo gradually transform from a promising young cardinal, a creature of his uncle's patronage, into a cardinal of genuine independent significance. He accumulated benefices, the ecclesiastical equivalent of income streams, drawing wealth from churches and monasteries across Europe. He participated in the ecclesiastical courts, heard cases, rendered judgments. He became, slowly but steadily, not just a member of the College of Cardinals, but one of its more prominent and powerful figures. His education, his connections, his obvious intellectual capacity, all of these converged to make him, within little more than a decade, one of the most substantial voices in the governance of the Church itself. Yet it is worth pausing here to recognize how unusual this was, and how much it depended on a particular accident of birth and timing. Rodrigo Borgia was intelligent, certainly, and capable, but there were hundreds of intelligent, capable men in the Church. What set him apart, what gave him the velocity to rise as he did, was his uncle's will and the uncle's power to enforce it. This is not to diminish Rodrigo's abilities, but rather to acknowledge the texture of the world in which those abilities flourished, a world where birth and patronage were often more consequential than merit, where the Church functioned partly as a spiritual institution and partly as a machine for the advancement of powerful families. Rodrigo Borgia understood this system intimately because he was its beneficiary, and perhaps, one might softly suggest, understanding how a system works from the inside, knowing its mechanisms and its vulnerabilities, is the first step toward dominating it entirely. To understand how quickly Rodrigo Borgia ascended, and how his uncle could elevate him so brazenly without scandal, or rather, with only whispered scandal, we must first step away from the gilded chambers and sit quietly with the machinery itself. The Church of the 15th century was not merely a spiritual institution, though it claimed to be. It was an economic apparatus, a vast, interlocking system of property, revenue, and favor, and cardinalates were its most precious currency. Picture, if you will, the structure of clerical wealth in those years. When a man received a benefice, a term from the Latin beneficium, literally a benefit, a favor granted, he received the right to the revenues of an ecclesiastical office without necessarily performing its duties. A man might be appointed bishop of a distant city he would never visit, abbot of a monastery he would never see, and collect the tithes and rents from the lands attached to it. The actual work, the blessing of the faithful, the saying of masses, the tending of souls, could be delegated to a subordinate priest, often poorly paid, while the beneficiary kept the lion's share. This was not corruption by accident, but corruption by design. It was how the church funded itself, and how ambitious families climbed. A cardinalate was different in scope, but similar in principle. When Alfonso de Borja secured his nephew's entry into the College of Cardinals, he was not simply granting him a scarlet cap and a place in religious ceremony. He was opening a door to a network of patronage that extended across Christendom. Each cardinal held multiple benefices scattered across Europe. Each benefice was a revenue stream. A cardinal in his 20s, as Rodrigo was when elevated, might command the wealth of a minor prince without ever raising a sword or governing a town. The money came to him. It flowed through channels established centuries before, and his only obligation was to maintain his position in the Cardinals' College and to remember, always, the patron who had lifted him there. The mechanism was subtle but relentless. When a benefice fell vacant, when an incumbent died, was promoted, or was persuaded to step aside, the Pope had the power to fill it, and the Pope, like every human creature with power, was inclined to favor those who had favored him, or those who might favor him in the future. Ecclesiastical offices were often awarded before they were actually empty. A man might be promised a benefice that would come available, and in the interim he would already be receiving its revenues. The promise itself was currency. The anticipated gift was as good as gold. And what of the papacy itself? How did one become pope in an age when the pope was not merely a spiritual figure, but a prince holding the papal states, territories across central Italy? The College of Cardinals elected a new pope whenever the incumbent died, and that college consisted of men who held benefices, who had patrons, who had obligations and debts and ambitions. An election was never simply a matter of piety or theological qualifications. It was a negotiation, a delicate, complex negotiation, in which every cardinal assessed what the next pope might offer him, what his existing benefices might be worth under a new reign, whether his influence might grow or diminish. Rodrigo Borgia understood this world intimately. He had been raised in it, shaped by it. His uncle had not merely given him a cardinal's hat as a gift to a nephew. Alphonse had placed him in the current of immense wealth and influence. Every benefice that came Rodrigo's way, and they came steadily, reinforced his status. Every benefice he held made him more valuable to potential allies. Every cardinal who owed him a small favor or who had received a small courtesy from him was a potential voter when the next conclave was called. And the tithes kept flowing, the rents kept arriving. Gold and silver came to Rome from monasteries in France, from bishoprics in Spain, from cathedral chapters in Germany and Italy. A man with multiple benefices was, in effect, a landlord of the church itself. He did not need to buy armies or conquest territory. The system bought these things for him, slowly, patiently, drip by drip. Wealth accumulated not through aggressive action, but through passive position. But there was another layer to this architecture, one that was less openly discussed. The papacy itself was occasionally for sale, or rather, the promise of it was. Ambitious cardinals would hint at generous patronage once elevated. Wealthy families like the Borgia would position themselves as valuable allies to a future pope. The expectation, the understanding, unspoken but clear, was that a man elected to the throne of St. Peter would remember those who had supported his candidacy. He might elevate their relatives. He might grant them territories. He might ensure that the benefices flowed in their direction. In a very real sense, the highest office in Christendom was accessible to those with wealth, connections, and the willingness to promise future favors in exchange for present support. Consider the perspective of a cardinal in the 1470s and 1480s, when Rodrigo was ascending. The man did not view his office primarily as a trust. He viewed it as an investment, or more accurately, as a position in a vast game of mutual obligation. The church was not separate from the world of politics and commerce. It was entirely enmeshed in it, and a man like Rodrigo, young, capable, wealthy through his benefices, and backed by the memory of his uncle's patronage, was a valuable ally. He had given favors. He could give more. Perhaps, someday, he might give the greatest favor of all. This was the world into which Rodrigo Borgia moved with such assured grace. Not a world of spiritual competition or theological dispute, though those things existed and mattered to some, but a world of quiet, patient accumulation, of understanding that the Church's vast apparatus of wealth and privilege could be navigated by those who understood its rules, of knowing that a benefice in hand today might lead to elevation tomorrow, and elevation today might lead to power and territory and dynastic influence for generations to come. The system itself did not judge whether this was righteous or corrupt. It simply was, and Rodrigo was very good at navigating it. For nearly 4 decades, Rodrigo Borgia occupied a position within the machinery of the Church that few historians have adequately explained, because it was less a title and more a conduit. Vice-Chancellor of the Roman Catholic Church, a post he held from the age of 26 almost until his ascension to the papal throne itself, was the kind of office that shaped the very mechanics by which power flowed through the corridors of the Vatican and rippled outward across Christendom. It was not a ceremonial role spoken of in great historical moments or celebrated in the councils of cardinals. It was quieter, deeper, more fundamental. It was the office of administration, of favor, of access. Picture for a moment the sheer volume of documents that crossed his desk in those decades. Appointments to benefices, the Church's vastly profitable system of granting revenues from ecclesiastical lands and offices to favored clergy, required his hand and his approval, his careful notation alongside the signature of whoever sat upon the throne of St. Peter. The right to collect the tithes from a monastery in Sicily, the income from a cathedral in Spain, the privilege of managing the spiritual care of a wealthy parish whose donations constituted real wealth, real power. Each decision was a currency transaction masked in theology. Rodrigo understood this language perfectly, perhaps better than anyone of his time, and he wielded it as an instrument of accumulation. His salary as vice-chancellor was, by the accounts that survive, quite substantial for the era, but salary was only the shallow surface of what flowed toward him. The truly significant wealth came from those benefices he dispensed, because the church allowed high-ranking clergy to hold multiple offices simultaneously. Rodrigo accumulated them as a merchant might accumulate bolts of silk or warehouses of grain. He held revenues from Spanish dioceses, Italian parishes, monasteries scattered across the Papal States. Some he administered directly, others he granted to relatives and allies, who then returned portions of the income to him in gratitude or obligation. It was a system so normalized within the ecclesiastical hierarchy that no one found it surprising or even particularly corrupt. It was simply how the church functioned, how the ambitious men who rose within its ranks secured themselves and their families against the uncertainties of earthly life. By the 1470s, Rodrigo Borgia had become one of the wealthiest men in Rome, and yet he lived with a particular kind of discretion, at least in the official records. The cardinal's robes were of the finest scarlet cloth. His residences were elegant, but not ostentatiously grand. He surrounded himself with art, manuscripts, the cultural trappings of a Renaissance man of taste and education. He maintained patronage relationships with artists and intellectuals, but these displays of taste and learning served another purpose entirely. They were the public face of a man whose true occupation was the accumulation of influence and resources through the intricate systems of the church. And then there was Vanozza dei Catane. This was the part of Rodrigo Borgia's life that the official histories glossed over with delicate silence, as if acknowledging it too directly might somehow taint the religious authority he wielded. Yet it was perhaps the most human aspect of his long, calculated existence. Vanozza was a woman of considerable intelligence and capable management. She came from a family of some standing but not exceptional wealth. Her father was a money changer, a respectable profession, but not one that would have granted her entrance into the highest circles. And yet she caught Rodrigo's attention, or he caught hers, or perhaps it was simply the kind of mutual recognition that sometimes occurs between two practical people who understand the arrangements by which the world actually operates. They began what might fairly be called a relationship sometime in the 1470s, though the Church's official stance was that such arrangements simply did not exist. Rodrigo Borgia, as a cardinal and a man of the cloth, was bound by vows of celibacy. The vow itself was not unusual to break. Many high-ranking clergy maintained relationships and sired children, but one did not announce this. One did not acknowledge it in any official capacity. And yet Vanozza was no casual companion summoned for brief visits and then forgotten. She and Rodrigo had an arrangement that suggests something closer to partnership. It was Vanozza who would manage his properties, oversee the maintenance of his various residences, and handle the domestic logistics of his expanding household. She was intelligent enough to understand the complex financial arrangements that constituted the underpinning of his wealth, practical enough to manage servants and estates, discreet enough to navigate the delicate social position of being the acknowledged but never officially recognized companion of one of the most powerful men in the church. There is even evidence that Rodrigo arranged advantageous marriages for Vanozza, which might seem contradictory. Why would a man maintain a long-term relationship with a woman and then marry her off to another man? But this was precisely the kind of pragmatic arrangement that the Renaissance church permitted. Vanozza married a series of husbands of increasing status, and her husbands understood, it seems, that she remained under the protection of a cardinal whose favor could mean considerable advancement. She bore Rodrigo children, and these children were acknowledged as his, though never in any public or official way that would have raised immediate scandal. The first of these children was Cesare, born around 1475 or 1476, the exact date lost to the incompleteness of historical records. Then Juan, whom Rodrigo particularly favored, born perhaps a year or two later. Then Lucrezia, whose birth sometime in the early 1480s would eventually make her one of the most famous women of her age, though for reasons that had far more to do with rumor and legend than with her actual life. And finally, Geoffrey, the youngest, born in the late 1480s, 4 children spanning a decade, all of whom would eventually emerge from the shadows of private life into the full glare of papal power and international attention. But in these years, the 1470s and 1480s, they were simply the children of Vanozza, raised in relative quiet, their paternity acknowledged within certain circles but not proclaimed. The question of how Rodrigo Borgia managed this part of his life, alongside his official ecclesiastical duties, is one that historians have wrestled with largely by ignoring it. He was a man of considerable discipline, apparently. He maintained his position at the heart of the church, continued to execute his duties as vice-chancellor with efficiency and care, participated in the formal religious life that his position required, and at the same time he maintained this other life, this relationship with Vanozza, this growing family whose existence depended entirely on his silence and discretion. It is perhaps worth reflecting on what this duality says about the Church of Rodrigo's time. The institution that proclaimed the sanctity of celibacy was led by men who systematically violated it. The organization that condemned simony, the sale of ecclesiastical offices, operated on a system in which offices were bought and sold as openly as any commodity in the marketplace. The clergy that was meant to set an example of poverty and detachment from earthly goods accumulated wealth with the energy of men building fortunes in trade. These were not hypocrisies that troubled Rodrigo Borgia, or if they did, he never indicated it. He was a creature of his time, operating according to the rules as they existed, understanding intuitively that the official doctrines and the actual practices of the Church were 2 entirely separate systems. In those decades as vice-chancellor, Rodrigo Borgia was building something. Not just wealth, though that was part of it. Not just influence within the Church, though that accumulated steadily. He was building a family. He was positioning them, patiently, carefully, for the kind of prominence that would only be possible if he himself managed to climb higher. And high, impossibly high, was where he was about to go. Within the grand palazzo that Rodrigo Borgia had come to occupy in Rome, a different kind of dynasty was taking shape, one not bound by titles or ecclesiastical law, but by blood and ambition so intertwined that they became almost indistinguishable. Though he wore the purple of a cardinal and held the office of vice-chancellor with all its attendant power and wealth, Rodrigo maintained a household as an ordinary man might, one anchored by a woman, Vanozza dei Catane, who bore him children in the careful silence that such arrangements required. The first of these children came into the world around the year 1475 or 1476, a boy whom Rodrigo named Cesare, after the great Caesar of antiquity. It was a name heavy with implication, a name that seemed to whisper of future conquests even in the cradle. The child was born into a peculiar circumstance, neither fully legitimate nor entirely hidden, belonging to a world that existed in the shadowed spaces between the Church's rigid prohibitions and the practical reality of men in power who fathered sons. Perhaps it was because of this ambiguous station, or perhaps because something in the boy's temperament inclined him toward it, but Cesare would grow to embody an intensity of purpose that set him apart from the beginning. A second son followed, in 1474 or thereabouts, christened Juan, where Cesare seemed to carry an almost austere quality even in childhood. Juan was said to possess a different character entirely, quicker to laughter, more openly ambitious in the way of a young man who knows himself to be favored by fortune. He was Rodrigo's pride in a particular way, the eldest son who might carry the Borgia name forward in a legitimate line, should such a thing prove possible. The hopes invested in Juan by his father were considerable, and they showed in the manner in which the boy was educated and elevated. Then came a daughter, Lucrezia, born sometime in the early 1480s, perhaps around 1480 or 1481, though the exact year has drifted away into the fog that obscures so much of Renaissance genealogy. Unlike her brothers, Lucrezia's birth could not be entirely concealed or positioned in the shadows. As the daughter of a cardinal, she would need to be married strategically, placed into alliances that would strengthen the Borgia position, made use of in the ancient and unforgiving game of dynastic power. Even as an infant in her father's house, she was already a commodity, already being weighed and measured for her eventual purpose. And yet the accounts that survive suggest something more tender in her childhood than mere instrumentality. A father's genuine affection, a daughter who was loved as a daughter, not only as a tool. The youngest of the four, Geoffrey, arrived sometime in the 1480s as well, another son who would occupy an unusual place in the family's calculations. Unlike Cesare or Juan, Geoffrey seems never to have aroused the intense expectations that his father placed upon his other children. He was younger, perhaps more fragile, or perhaps there were simply only so many ambitions that could be distributed among the children of a single man. However powerful that man might be, Geoffrey would find his own path, though it would prove to be the quieter one, the one that attracted less scrutiny, less hope, and in the end, less infamy. As these children grew through their earliest years, Rome itself was beginning to take notice of their family in ways that had not occurred before. Rodrigo Borgia was no longer merely a cardinal among cardinals, one clergyman among many in the crowded and competitive circles of ecclesiastical power. He was becoming a presence, a figure whose wealth and influence seemed to grow almost visibly year by year. His palazzo became a place where important people called, where business was conducted with the kind of discretion that only genuine power could command. The Borgia name, which had been Spanish, provincial, was beginning to acquire an Italian resonance, beginning to echo through the corridors of Roman nobility. The children themselves became visible in the society of Rome in a gradual and careful way. They were presented, as the children of great nobles were presented, at the appropriate functions and gatherings. Lucrezia, as she grew into childhood and then toward adolescence, was displayed in the manner of a valuable ornament, beautiful, educated, pious in the manner expected of well-born young women. The accounts of her beauty may have been exaggerated by later chroniclers, as such accounts so often are, but there seems to have been something genuinely striking about her even then, something that made her memorable in a way that went beyond the mere fact of her father's eminence. Did she understand, even then, that her life would not be entirely her own? The question lingers like the fading afternoon light through a high window. Cesare and Juan, meanwhile, were educated with the intensity that their father's position and wealth made possible. They had tutors, they had exposure to the classical learning that was beginning to flood back into Italy from the great libraries of Constantinople and the scholarship of the Greek world. Both boys showed promise, though the kind of promise each displayed was quite different. Juan seemed content to follow the path his father had laid out for him, the church, the climb through ecclesiastical ranks, the accumulation of benefices and authority. Cesare, even as a young boy, seemed to be calculating something else, as if he were already aware that there were other kinds of power in the world beyond what the cardinal's hat could offer. What is most striking about this period is how thoroughly Rodrigo Borgia folded his family into his own ascent, making them not merely beneficiaries of his success, but instruments of its continuation. The children were not accidental byproducts of his power. They were part of the very machinery of that power, integrated into his vision of what the Borgia name might become, and Rome, for its part, was watching. The city that had grown accustomed to the irregular arrangements of its clergy, that understood the unspoken rules by which powerful men maintained households while technically observing their vows, saw in Rodrigo Borgia something more brazen than what had come before, not merely a cardinal with children, but a cardinal who seemed to be building a dynasty, consolidating wealth and influence across generations. The gossip, of course, was considerable. The whispers about Vannozza, about the children, about the arrangements that kept them present, but not quite public, not quite acknowledged. These formed a constant low murmur beneath the official surfaces of Roman society. And yet the Borgias continued to rise. Rodrigo's power within the church only deepened. His wealth continued to accumulate. His children were placed in advantageous matches and positions. Whatever moral discomfort the situation might have generated, it was not sufficient to slow his progress. In Renaissance Rome, power had a way of resolving such contradictions, or at least of rendering them invisible through the simple expedient of not looking too closely. And so the children grew, in this peculiar household that was at once hidden and visible, at once shameful and utterly accepted. They grew into young people marked by the strange privilege of their position, never quite fully integrated into the world of legitimate nobility, yet far above the common people. They grew knowing their father's name and what it meant, what it could purchase, what doors it could open. And as they grew, so too did the ambitions of Rodrigo Borgia expand, as if the success of his children, their promise, their beauty, their intelligence, had persuaded him that there were no heights to which the Borgia family could not climb. The papacy itself, that ultimate seat of power, was no longer an impossibility, but a direction, something toward which all other movements and arrangements were beginning to tend. The winter of 1492 arrived in Rome with a particular cold that seemed to settle into the very stones of the Vatican itself. Pope Innocent V, who had occupied the throne of Peter for 13 years, lay dying in his chambers while the city held its breath and the cardinals began their slow, careful movements through the corridors of power. Innocent had been a weak pontiff, some said, burdened by age, distracted by the management of his own illegitimate children, more concerned with the splendid gardens he had commissioned than with the renewal of the Church's moral authority. His decline had been gradual, almost merciful, a fading rather than a sudden extinguishing. But in that fading lay opportunity, and the College of Cardinals understood opportunity as surely as merchants understand the turning of the seasons. Rodrigo Borgia, now approaching his 60th year, had spent the better part of 4 decades accumulating the invisible threads of influence that bound the Church together. As Vice-Chancellor, he had witnessed every succession, every shift in allegiance, every secret transaction that moved beneath the surface of ecclesiastical life. He had watched cardinals rise and fall. He had seen how favor could be translated into concrete power, into lands, revenues, the right to appoint bishops in distant dioceses, the authority to hear confessions of kings. And he had never stopped cultivating his position, never allowed his network of allies to grow distant or indifferent to his interests. The conclave that would follow Innocent's death was not, it should be said, a sudden or unexpected event. These conclaves never were. The machinery of succession in the 15th century Church operated with a particular rhythm that insiders understood with almost musical precision. Word had begun to circulate months before Innocent actually died. Whispers in the antechambers, careful conversations between cardinals who felt secure in the presence of trusted allies. Who would be the next pope? Which families would benefit from a particular choice? What were the consequences of allowing one candidate to dominate, while another faction grew restless and powerful? The cardinals who gathered in Rome in early August of 1492 were drawn from the great noble families of Italy and from the peninsulas and kingdoms beyond. They came from the House of Colonna and the House of Orsini, from the Medici circle in Florence, from Spanish connections and French interests. Some had been elevated to the purple, specifically because powerful secular rulers wanted eyes and ears in the papal court. Others had purchased their cardinalates outright with gold that had been moved quietly from family coffers to the church's coffers. The notion that these men would approach the election of a pope with purely spiritual motives was, even in the minds of many contemporaries, rather quaint. Power had its own logic, and that logic operated on the level of family interest, political alliance, and strategic position. Rodrigo Borgia understood this calculus as well as any man alive. He had cultivated relationships with cardinals for decades. He had been generous with his patronage, discreet with his confidences, and shrewd in his assessments of which men could be moved by promises of advancement and which men required something more material. Some historians have suggested that his path to the papacy was paved with outright bribery, payments made to cardinals in exchange for their votes. The specifics are difficult to verify with absolute certainty, though contemporary sources speak of significant sums moving through various channels in the weeks leading up to the conclave. A cardinal here received confirmation of his bishopric. Another there was promised increased revenues from certain church properties. A third, perhaps, was given assurance that his nephew would be appointed to a lucrative position. These were not violations of church law in any formal sense. They were simply how business was conducted. The actual conclave took place in the Sistine Chapel, though it was not yet the chapel bearing that name in the full grandeur we might imagine today. The cardinals were locked away, according to the ancient protocols, forbidden from communicating with the outside world until they had selected their new head. The voting proceeded through ballots, with each cardinal casting his choice and the tally being recorded. On the first day of the conclave, Rodrigo Borgia emerged as a clear favourite, but not quite with the overwhelming consensus that would have made his election a foregone conclusion. What happened in those chambers, the precise negotiations, the promises made and remade, the calculations that shifted hour by hour, remains somewhat veiled by the distance of 5 centuries. But the broad outlines are clear enough. Rodrigo had enemies among certain cardinal factions, particularly those with French sympathies or those who belonged to families hostile to Spanish interests. Yet he also had something that many of his rivals lacked, a combination of wealth, demonstrated competence, and the backing of multiple powerful constituencies. The Spanish cardinals supported him, naturally, as a man of Spanish blood who would advance their nation's interests in Rome. Italian cardinals, who had benefited from his patronage as vice-chancellor, moved toward him as well. By the second or third day, accounts vary slightly on the exact timeline, it became clear that Rodrigo had assembled sufficient support to carry the day. The final votes showed a clear majority in his favour, and on August 11, 1492, the College of Cardinals formally announced that Rodrigo Borgia had been elected pope. He would take the name Alexander VI, invoking the memory of an ancient pope from the early centuries of the Church, a figure from that distant golden age when the papacy had supposedly been pure and uncompromised. The irony of that choice, given the very contemporary and worldly means by which his election had been secured, was either lost on the new pope, or perhaps perfectly understood and deliberately embraced as a kind of wry commentary on the nature of power. The streets of Rome filled with people learning the news. Some welcomed the election of a man who was at least educated and competent, who had proven administrative abilities, and who represented a kind of stability after the weakness of his predecessor. Others harbored private doubts or open hostility, depending on their political positions. The cardinals who had voted for him, or who had been persuaded to vote for him, or who had exchanged their votes for promises, filed out of the chapel with the knowledge that they had just participated in something that was simultaneously perfectly ordinary and thoroughly corrupt, a paradox that lay at the very heart of late medieval ecclesiastical politics. And so the man who had spent 40 years accumulating power in the shadows of the church suddenly stepped into the full light of supreme authority. The question that now emerged, softly but insistently, was what he would do with that power, and how far his ambitions would extend beyond the walls of the Vatican itself. Now, what becomes interesting in the quiet aftermath of that August conclave, when the cardinals had filed back into the light of Rome's streets and Rodrigo Borgia knelt before the assembled city as Pope Alexander VI, was not the election itself, but the stories that would grow around it, spreading like ink through still water, until no one could quite separate what had actually occurred from what people believed, desperately wanted to believe, or feared might be true. The word that hung over that moment was simony. The buying and selling of ecclesiastical office. It was, by any measure, profoundly forbidden by church law, condemned in councils stretching back centuries, a sin that carried the weight of biblical transgression. Saint Peter, the first pope, had declared it an abomination. Yet here was Rodrigo Borgia, whose wealth was immense, whose family connections were formidable, whose ambitions had never been veiled, ascending to the throne of Saint Peter at an age when his vitality remained unmistakable, his hunger for power still visibly sharp. The contemporary chroniclers who witnessed those days offered accounts that ranged from the cautiously skeptical to the openly scandalized. Some whispered of promises, of gold distributed in careful measure to key cardinals whose votes seemed uncertain. Others spoke of lands granted in perpetuity, of benefices promised to the families of influential princes of the church. A few observers, those given to dramatic notation, claimed outright that the conclave had been an auction, that cardinals had openly negotiated their support like merchants in a marketplace. Yet even as these accounts circulated through Rome's convents and palaces, surviving in letters and diaries that would be read centuries hence, no one left behind a document that could be called definitive proof, no ledger, no list of payments, no cardinal's confession that money had changed hands. This absence of concrete evidence is, perhaps, where the real history becomes most curious to examine, for it left a gap, a space where fact and interpretation could spiral away from one another, where later historians and moralists could project their own presumptions onto the events of 1492, like shadows cast on a stone wall. The question that emerges, then, is one that has occupied scholars across the centuries. How much of what we believe about the Borgia simony was actual corruption, documented and deliberate, and how much was the understandable suspicion of a world in which such corruption was common? Renaissance Rome was, after all, a society saturated with the buying and selling of preferment. Cardinals routinely acquired their positions through family influence and financial leverage. Popes granted offices to their relatives as a matter of routine governance. Nepotism was not viewed as a moral failing, but as a structural necessity, almost a constitutional principle of how power ought to flow within the church hierarchy. Against that background, the notion that Rodrigo Borgia's election might have involved some exchange of favor and wealth was not remarkable. It was expected, almost inevitable. Yet Rodrigo was different in one crucial respect. He was not simply the cardinal of an old family gaining a slight advantage. He was the outsider, the Spanish cardinal in a college dominated by Italian lines and Roman traditions. He was the vice-chancellor, yes, a position of tremendous influence, but he remained in some sense an Aravist, a man whose power, however substantial, could still be perceived as contingent, dependent on patronage, rather than rooted in the ancient soil of Italian nobility. That made his elevation to the papacy itself an event of a different magnitude, a rupture in the expected order of things. And in such moments of rupture, suspicion tends to congeal into certainty. Gossip hardens into chronicle. The later historians, those who wrote in the 16th and 17th centuries, when the Borgias had become cautionary figures in the moral instruction of Europe, found themselves facing a peculiar problem. They had access to no smoking gun, no cardinal's testimony, no payment records that could stand as irrefutable proof of simony. What they had instead were rumor, implication, the general character of Rodrigo Borgia as a man known to love wealth and power, and the circumstantial likelihood that money and promises had played some role in the proceedings. Some scholars, those inclined toward moral severity, essentially assumed that simony must have occurred, because Rodrigo Borgia was the sort of man who would have engaged in it, and because the temptation and the opportunity had both been present. Other historians, perhaps more cautious in temperament or more inclined to credit the complexity of historical causation, argued that Rodrigo's election, while undoubtedly aided by his vast wealth, his network of allies, and the favors he could distribute, might not have constituted simony in the strict sense. They noted that his long service as vice-chancellor had earned him genuine respect among the cardinals. His diplomatic skill was recognized. His connections to powerful Spanish and Aragonese houses made him attractive to cardinals, seeking to influence the balance of power in Italian politics. A man with such credentials, they suggested, might have been elected on the basis of genuine political calculation rather than simple bribery. The truth, as is often the case with such questions, likely dwelt somewhere in the unilluminated space between these two poles. It seems almost certain that Rodrigo used his vast wealth as leverage, that he made promises of benefices, of appointments, of protection, to cardinals whose votes he required. It seems equally certain that some element of genuine political appeal figured into his election, that cardinals saw in him not merely a source of gold, but a man of consequence and capability. Whether this constitutes simony depends rather acutely on where one draws the line between the acceptable distribution of favor, which was routine, and the unacceptable selling of the papacy itself, which was forbidden. Medieval and Renaissance theologians had, in fact, spent considerable energy trying to define precisely this distinction. They understood that some exchange of interest was inevitable in any transaction involving power. What made simony simony, they argued, was the direct equation of money or goods for a sacred office, the treating of the spiritual as a commodity. But the papal conclave of 1492 was not conducted with such categorical clarity. The inducements offered to cardinals were offered in the form of future possibilities, of political alignment, of patronage networks that would benefit both the giver and the receiver. No one stood up and said, "I give you 10,000 ducats for your vote for Borgia." The whole affair was conducted with the diplomatic subtlety that such transactions required, which means it was also conducted in a way that left no clear forensic trace. And so we are left, 5 centuries later, with a curious historiographical situation. The Borgias are famous for simony in the papacy, yet the case against them remains ultimately circumstantial. What we know is that Rodrigo Borgia had the means, the motive, and the likely opportunity to engage in the buying of support. What we cannot definitively prove is that he did so in sufficient quantity to constitute the main engine of his election, rather than one factor among several. The legend of the Borgias, as the ultimate expression of ecclesiastical corruption, became so powerful, so useful as a symbol of everything that was wrong with the late medieval church, that it perhaps overshadowed the messier and more ambiguous historical record. This is not to absolve the Borgias or to suggest that they were paragons of virtue operating within an otherwise corrupt system. Rather, it is to acknowledge that the line between what we think we know and what we can actually document in matters as old and as politically sensitive as these is often thinner than we would like to believe. The story of the Borgia election became, in a sense, a screen onto which historians and moralists projected their own assumptions about power, wealth, and the spiritual, leaving us to wonder, even now, precisely where the facts end and the interpretation begins. Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI, stood in chambers that had housed the successors of St. Peter for more than 1,000 years, and the weight of that history pressed upon him differently than the ambition that had brought him there. The conclave had concluded, the payments had been made, the promises whispered in shadow were now binding in light, and now came the peculiar work of a pope who possessed not only spiritual authority, but the obligations of a temporal prince, a man who must somehow balance the salvation of souls with the survival of kingdoms, and above all, the elevation of his own blood. The papacy in 1492 was not the isolated ecclesiastical throne we might imagine from a distance. It was a throne bound to the intricate, exhausting machinery of Italian politics. The peninsula itself was a tapestry of competing interests. The Kingdom of Naples to the south, controlled by the Aragonese crown, the Duchy of Milan and the Republic of Venice to the north, eternally suspicious of one another, the Florentine Republic under the Medici, the Papal States themselves, a band of territory stretching across the center of the peninsula like a spine, and beyond the Alps, France and Spain, increasingly hungry, increasingly powerful, watched these Italian states the way a wolf circles a flock of sheep. Alexander VI inherited not merely a throne, but a precarious position within this dance. The papacy's temporal power was real but limited. It could not match the armies of France or the wealth of Venice. It could not impose its will through force alone. Instead, it had to move through alliances, through marriages that bound noble families to papal interests, through the careful distribution of favors and offices, through the ancient currency of the Church itself, benefices, positions, ecclesiastical appointments that brought both spiritual authority and material wealth. And so, almost immediately, the new pope began thinking of his children not as illegitimate offspring to be hidden away in shame, though the shame existed in theory, in the pretense that covered everything, but as instruments of dynastic expansion. This was not unusual. Cardinals had fathered children for centuries. Popes had elevated their nephews and sons. But Alexander approached it with a particular clarity of purpose, a particular willingness to act openly what others had done in shadow. His eldest son, Juan, Duke of Gandia, was already in Spain, secure in his titles and lands, maintained at a distance from Rome for reasons both practical and protective. But his other children, born to Vanozza during his years as cardinal, were now in Rome, and they were young, unmarried, and valuable. They were assets to be placed strategically across the Italian landscape, each marriage a thread in a web designed to hold the fractured peninsula in alliance with the Borgia name. Consider Lucrezia. She was perhaps 13 or 14 years old when her father became pope, perhaps younger. The exact date of her birth is lost to the fog that surrounds so much of early Borgia history. She was beautiful, we are told, though beauty in Renaissance princes meant something different than it does now. It meant bearing, presence, the ability to be displayed, and more crucially, it meant legitimacy, or the appearance of it. Alexander, in one of his early and most calculated acts, issued a papal bull declaring Lucrezia legitimate, erasing the stain of her birth, making her marriageable to the highest nobility of Italy. She could now be offered not to a minor merchant or provincial lord, but to the great houses that mattered. The first marriage was arranged quickly. In 1493, just months into Alexander's papacy, Lucrezia was married to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, a man of some significance in the northern Italian political landscape. The Sforza family controlled Milan, or rather, ruled it through the fragile regency of Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro, the Moor, a figure of considerable power and cunning. The marriage was a statement of alliance, a sealing of bonds between the Borgia papacy and one of the most important ducal families of the north. And it was entirely practical. Giovanni Sforza received the dignity of connection to the Pope himself. The Borgias received a foothold in the intricate politics of Milan and the surrounding region. Cesare, her brother, was a different sort of problem and opportunity entirely. He was the Pope's second son, but the firstborn in Rome, the one raised closest to the halls of power, groomed almost from infancy for ecclesiastical office. Before his father ascended the throne, Cesare had already been appointed to a bishopric. Now, as Pope's son, he was elevated to the cardinalate with astonishing speed. He was made Archbishop of Valencia and cardinal at an age when most men were still learning to govern their own modest estates. This was shameless nepotism, barefaced and unashamed, the sort of thing that would have shocked an earlier generation of churchmen, but which Alexander VI seemed to regard as simply the proper order of things. Yet even as he placed Cesare in the highest ranks of the church, even as he gathered the revenues of the church into Borgia hands, Alexander VI was beginning to sense something in the political currents around him. Cesare was too ambitious, perhaps, to remain content as a cardinal. He was too capable, too driven. But that is a thread we approach only gradually. For now, Cesare remained in the red hat, accumulating wealth, learning the machinery of power, watching his father navigate the treacherous waters of Italian politics. The Pope's balancing act was extraordinary in its complexity. He could not favor one Italian power too openly without provoking the others. France was ascendant, but Spain was his family's ancient seat. Naples was ruled by the Aragonese crown, which meant it was, in a sense, a Spanish possession, a family matter. Yet Venice and Milan had to be managed carefully, cajoled, assured of the papacy's neutrality or its benevolent attention. And all the while, the machinery of the church had to be maintained. Cardinals had to be elevated, benefices distributed, ecclesiastical politics navigated with the same delicate touch required for the temporal world. There was a kind of beautiful, terrible logic to what Alexander was doing. He was not a particularly spiritual man, this much is clear from the records, but he was intelligent. He understood that power in this moment required the marriage of the sacred and the profane, that a pope could not simply rule the church as a priest-king, withdrawn from the world. A pope in Renaissance Italy was necessarily a prince, necessarily entangled in the ambitions and anxieties of princes around him. And if one was going to be a prince, one might as well be a effective one. One might as well secure one's position and that of one's family. The marriages continued. Geoffrey, the youngest of the children, was married off to a daughter of the King of Naples, binding the Borgia family to the southern kingdom. Each marriage was a stone laid in a foundation, each alliance a move in a game that stretched across the entire peninsula. And all the while, the Pope presided over the church, canonizing saints, issuing papal bulls, managing the spiritual life of Christendom, while simultaneously engineering one of the great dynastic ascensions in Renaissance Europe. The contemporaries who watched all this unfold were not always approving. There were whispers in the corridors of Rome, glances exchanged among the cardinals who had voted for Rodrigo Borgia and now found themselves governed by a man so unapologetic in his pursuit of family advancement. Yet there was also a kind of grudging admiration. Alexander was efficient. He was clear about his intentions. He did not hide his ambitions behind elaborate theological justifications, though justifications existed if one wanted them. He was, in a peculiar way, honest in his dishonesty, frank in his corruption. And perhaps that frankness, that clarity of purpose, was part of what allowed him to maintain his position for so long. The papacy in this era was not a place for the faint of heart. not a place for those who believed too sincerely in their own spiritual purity. It was a position of power, contested and precarious, and to hold it required not only intelligence and ruthlessness, but also the ability to move through the world as a politician first, a priest second. The early years of Alexander VI's papacy were years of construction, of carefully laying the groundwork for Borgia power. His children were being positioned like pieces on a board. His alliances were being forged through marriage, through the distribution of patronage, through the cultivation of relationships with the great powers of Italy and beyond. He was building something, though perhaps he did not yet fully understand what shape it would eventually take. The transformation that awaited Cesare Borgia in the 1490s would set him apart from nearly every cardinal Rome had ever known, for he possessed something that most of his scarlet-robed brothers lacked: a hunger for power that could not be contained within the walls of the Vatican, nor satisfied by the accumulation of benefices and bishoprics that sustained other ambitious clergy. Where his father had climbed toward the papacy, through careful cultivation of the Church's machinery, Cesare would eventually find the institution itself too narrow for his ambitions, and the cardinal's hat, for all its prestige and privilege, would come to feel like a cage. Born into this ecclesiastical privilege almost by inheritance, Cesare had been groomed from childhood for high ecclesiastical office. His education had been careful and thorough. The languages, the theology, the intricate protocols of the curia that a cardinal must navigate with the precision of a master courtier. By most measures, his path forward seemed assured. He had been elevated to the cardinalate in his early 20s, like so many young men born into families of influence, and for a time he played his role with apparent devotion. He accumulated vast benefices and revenues, the enormous wealth that flowed to those who held multiple sees and abbacies. He participated in papal conclaves and enjoyed the informal power networks that existed among the cardinals, those shadowy conversations in the gardens and private chambers where real decisions were often made before the formal votes were cast. And yet, there exists in the historical record a growing restlessness in Cesare's early adulthood, a sense that something in him resisted the wearing of the red hat, resisted the vows and ceremonial constraints that came with it. The precise moment of his conversion from ambitious cardinal to would-be secular prince is difficult to pinpoint, obscured as it is by centuries and by the fact that such decisions were rarely announced in advance. It happened gradually, then quite suddenly. Perhaps it began with the spectacle of his father's papacy itself, the realization that Alexander VI possessed temporal power as well as spiritual authority, that the Pope sat not merely as a prelate, but as a sovereign ruler of the Papal States, commander of armies, maker of treaties. For a young man of Cesare's temperament, this must have suggested new possibilities. By the 1490s, the landscape of Italian politics was shifting in ways that created both danger and opportunity. The French King Louis XII had begun to take interest in the peninsula, and with him came the threat and promise of invasion, the displacement of existing powers, the opening of new avenues for those clever enough to seize them. Cesare watched these currents with a clarity that set him apart from his elder brother Juan, who remained fixed in military ambitions without the subtlety that true power requires. The question that seems to have occupied Cesare's mind was not how to become a wealthier cardinal, but how to become something unprecedented: a secular prince, ruler of territory, commander of soldiers, answerable ultimately only to himself and to the vagaries of military fortune. In 1498, that ambition took concrete form. Cesare, by then in his mid-20s, made the decision to resign from the College of Cardinals. It was an extraordinary act, almost shocking in its boldness. Cardinals did not simply remove their vestments and walk away from the most powerful institution in Christendom. To To do so was to reject not only a position of immense privilege, but the entire ecclesiastical identity that had been prepared for him since childhood. It was to reject, in a sense, his father's chosen path and his father's world. Yet Pope Alexander VI, rather than opposing his son's ambition, appears to have understood it, perhaps even encouraged it. For Alexander VI possessed something that other popes lacked: a willingness to blur the lines between papal interest and family interest, to use the resources of the Church not for its own aggrandizement alone, but for the creation of a Borgia dynasty that would endure beyond his own papacy. With the resignation accepted, Cesare was free to pursue a secular career, and his father moved quickly to place him in a position of military command. The next logical step was the Romagna, that region of north-central Italy that stretched from the Apennines to the Adriatic, that had once been part of the papal patrimony, but had fragmented into a dozen petty lordships and city-states, each governed by a local lord or signore, who held power through military strength, alliances, and the patronage of larger powers. It was a region that had long troubled popes, for its very existence as a collection of independent powers undermined papal temporal authority. For Cesare, it represented something different, an opportunity to carve out a kingdom, to build a state from the fractured remnants of what had once been papal territory, to prove himself not merely as a cardinal and the Pope's son, but as a prince in his own right. The idea of a unified Romagna under Borgia control was not entirely new. Popes had long dreamed of recovering these lands and bringing them back under Rome's direct authority. But what made Cesare's ambition different was its personal character, its focus on building not merely papal territory, but Borgia territory, a dynastic inheritance that could be passed down to his heirs. He began to articulate a vision of a consolidated state, a powerful principality that could stand as an equal among the other powers of Italy. It was a dream that had echoes of both his uncle's ecclesiastical ambitions and the military ambitions of his brother Juan, but refined and sharpened by Cesare's particular intelligence. The means by which he intended to achieve this vision, however, would prove as controversial and debated as any aspect of his career. He would need to accumulate wealth, certainly, and he would have access to the Church's revenues through his father. He would need military power, which he would build through the careful hiring of skilled mercenary captains and the use of French soldiers and French military support. Most importantly, he would need to take the scattered lordships and fortified cities of the Romagna and bring them under his direct control, and this would require not merely diplomacy and payment, but the decisive application of force. The question of how far Cesare was willing to go, how much blood he was willing to spill, how ruthlessly he was willing to use terror and intimidation as tools of statecraft, would become the central question of his principality and would echo through history long after his power had crumbled to dust. For now, in these first years after his resignation from the cardinalate, Cesare stood at a threshold. Behind him lay the security of ecclesiastical privilege, the ceremonial power of the Church, the guaranteed revenue of his benefices. Ahead lay something far more uncertain, the possibility of creating something unprecedented in Italian politics, a Borgia kingdom that would rival the great houses, but also the risk of utter failure, of losing everything in pursuit of an ambition that many would consider impossible or even mad. He had his father's support, at least for now, and he had access to the Church's resources. What he lacked was the territory, the legitimacy, and the proven military prowess that came only through conquest. The transformation from cardinal to secular prince had been formally accomplished with his resignation, but the transformation of Cesare Borgia into a true prince, into a figure that would inspire both fear and fascination, that would draw the attention of observers like Niccolò Machiavelli, that would become a prototype for the calculating ruler who puts power before piety, that transformation was only beginning. The Romagna awaited him, with all its feudal complexity, its proud city republics and its local strongmen, all of them about to discover that the papal interests that had once been a distant concern were now embodied in the ambitious young man who had laid aside the cardinal's hat and taken up the mantle of a secular prince. The map of Europe in the 1490s was not a fixed thing, but rather a living document redrawn with each treaty, each marriage, each whispered negotiation in candlelit chambers. And nowhere was this more true than in the delicate geometries of power that touch the papal states, that modest territorial spine running through the Italian peninsula like a thread connecting past to future. The Borgia family's ascendance, you see, could not have happened in isolation. It rose and fell on the tides of greater currents, the ambitions of France, the calculated interests of Spain, the shifting weight of alliances that seemed to change with the seasons, as unpredictable as morning mist over the Tiber. It was in the year 1494 that a young French king named Charles the Faillite, barely more than a boy when he inherited the throne, decided to make a claim upon the Kingdom of Naples. His reasoning was sound enough in the logic of medieval succession. He traced his lineage backward, through generations of claims and counterclaims, until he arrived at a justification that seemed, to him at least, unassailable. But the implications of his decision rippled outward like stones cast into still water, troubling every prince and pope from the Alps to the Mediterranean. Naples was a prize, you understand. It was rich, it was strategically positioned, and it was held by the House of Aragon, which meant that any French incursion southward would necessarily upset the balance that had kept the peninsula from descending into open warfare. Alexander VI, having only recently ascended to the papal throne through that complicated conclave of 1492, found himself in the position of a man standing on a narrow bridge between two approaching armies. To his north lay Milan and its ruling Sforza family, already nervous about French intentions. To his south lay Naples, a kingdom that had once been firmly within the Aragonese sphere of influence. And beyond that sphere lay Spain itself, the homeland from which Alexander VI and his family had originally come. The Pope could not afford to be seen as disloyal to his Spanish cousins, yet he also could not afford to provoke the French king, whose armies were now marching southward with unmistakable intent. What emerged from this pressure, from these competing desires and necessities, was the Treaty of Granada, negotiated in 1494 between France and Spain. It was a document that attempted to do something quite remarkable, to divide up the spoils of Italy and North Africa without actually going to war, or at least without admitting that one was going to war. The treaty essentially acknowledged that both France and Spain had interests and claims in the Italian peninsula, and rather than fight for every scrap of territory, they would divide their ambitions. Spain would maintain its influence in the south and the islands, while France would be allowed to pursue its claims in Naples and other northern territories, at least for the moment. It was, in essence, an agreement to not actively work against each other while both of them pursued their own advantages. For the Borgia family, this treaty created an extraordinarily delicate situation, because the Borgias occupied a uniquely ambiguous position in the Italian political landscape. They were Spanish in origin, bound by blood and sentiment to Ferdinand and Isabella, the Spanish monarchs who had unified their realm and expelled the Moors. Yet Alexander VI was the Pope, the spiritual leader of Christendom, theoretically above the petty squabbles of secular princes, bound only to the interests of the Church and the maintenance of papal temporal power. These two identities could coexist peacefully, or they could collide with terrifying consequences. As Charles the Fair's army pressed southward into Italy, as cities fell and shifted hands with startling rapidity, Alexander VI had to consider what was best for the Papal States. that modest collection of territories that provided the Church with its earthly wealth and independence. If he aligned too openly with Spain, he risked antagonizing France and inviting French armies to march through papal lands. If he aligned with France, he risked offending Spain and potentially losing access to Spanish resources, Spanish military support, and the valuable connections that bound his family to Iberian nobility. The solution, as is so often the case in such circumstances, was to try to have it both ways, to extend favors and assurances to both sides while committing fully to neither. Consider, if you will, the position of Cesare Borgia during this period. He held the position of cardinal, a title that gave him immense prestige within the Church, but also tied him to his father's diplomatic necessities. His legitimacy as a cardinal depended upon papal favor and upon the goodwill of the College of Cardinals, many of whom were suspicious of Spanish influence and nepotism within the Church. Yet he was also the son of the Pope, and his father's needs were his needs, his ambitions inseparable from the family's fortunes. The Treaty of Granada, then, did not so much resolve the Borgia family's predicament as it gave them space in which to maneuver. With France and Spain having formally acknowledged their spheres of influence, and with both powers pursuing their own Italian campaigns, the Borgias had room to make strategic marriages, to accept favors from both sides, to position themselves as valuable intermediaries in the larger game being played out across the peninsula. The treaty was not a solution, it was an opening, a moment in which the rules of the game had been rewritten in such a way that clever players with good timing and ruthless instincts might advance their positions. Think of it like watching fish move through a current, adjusting their fins with subtle movements, reading the flow of water around them, never fighting directly against forces too large to resist, but instead using those forces to navigate toward deeper pools where food might be found. The Borgias were learning, in those years of the mid-1490s, to read the currents of European politics with ever greater sophistication, and the Treaty of Granada, for all that it was negotiated between French and Spanish monarchs, ultimately shaped the waters through which the family would swim. What is fascinating, and perhaps what we might sit with for a moment before moving forward, is that the treaty solved almost nothing in the long term. Charles V would indeed reach Naples, would claim it, would hold it only briefly before being forced to retreat. The Italian peninsula would descend further into warfare, into the long, brutal contests between foreign powers that would dominate the next half-century. And the Borgias, for all their maneuvering and their careful positioning, would find themselves increasingly caught between larger forces, increasingly forced to make choices that would either elevate them to extraordinary heights or cast them down into ruin. But that story, that darker chapter of ambition and consequence, comes later. For now, know simply that the world was shifting around them, that great powers were beginning to move, and that the family of a Spanish pope was learning to dance between them. The Treaty of Granada was not the cause of what would follow, but it was the map upon which events would be drawn, and in the spaces it created, the Borgias found opportunity. As the 1590s unfolded, and Rome's marble corridors grew thick with Borgia ambition, there remained one instrument of power that the family had not yet fully deployed. Lucrezia Borgia, the Pope's daughter, beautiful by all accounts, though we must remember that beauty itself became a kind of currency in the hands of Renaissance chroniclers, stood at a peculiar threshold in her family's rising fortunes. She was born around 1479, which made her barely into her adolescence when her father began to consider how best to use her in the grand chess game of Italian politics. And so it was that Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, a minor but respectable nobleman from the fractured landscape of the Romagna, became the object of elaborate courtship and negotiation. The marriage itself served purposes that had nothing to do with the young couple themselves. which was, of course, entirely ordinary for the time. Pesaro occupied a strategic position, not so distant that it could be ignored, not so powerful that it could refuse. Giovanni Sforza descended from the Sforza clan, the same family that had produced dukes and condottieri, though he himself occupied a quieter branch of that tree. What mattered to Alexander VI was not Giovanni's personal standing, but rather what his marriage to Lucrezia might secure. An alliance with Pesaro meant a foothold in the Romagna. It meant a voice, however small, in the councils of the peninsula's northern territories. It meant that when the Pope's eyes turned northward toward the scattered lands he wished to consolidate, there would be a sympathetic noble already bound by blood and marriage. The wedding took place in the summer of 1493, just a year after Alexander VI's ascension to the throne. Lucrezia was scarcely 14 years old. By the standards of Renaissance nobility, this was not unusual. Betrothals and marriages of children were common instruments of statecraft. Yet the fact remains that a girl barely past childhood found herself transported from Rome to Pesaro as the wife of a man likely twice her age. Contemporary accounts describe celebrations and festivities, though these descriptions often tell us more about what the chroniclers thought proper to record than about what actually occurred. We know that gifts were exchanged, that the union was treated as a matter of diplomatic significance, and that for a time the arrangement appeared to serve its intended purpose. But alliances in Renaissance Italy had the peculiar quality of flowers pressed between pages, beautiful in their moment, fragile and prone to sudden decay. Within a few years, the political landscape had shifted. France and Spain pressed against the peninsula from opposite directions. The Papal States faced threats both from external powers and from ambitious nobles within their own territories. What had seemed a valuable connection to Pesaro began to appear, in the cold calculus of papal strategy, less essential. Moreover, as Cesare Borgia's ambitions grew and his military campaigns through the Romagna expanded, having Lucrezia tied to Pesaro became awkward rather than advantageous. Pesaro might need to be absorbed or neutralized. How could that be accomplished if the Pope's daughter was married to its lord? By 1497, the marriage had become an inconvenience, a divorce, or more precisely, an annulment, for the Church did not recognize divorce, but rather the declaration that a marriage had never been valid, began to seem desirable. Giovanni Sforza, sensing the shifting winds, was not inclined to resist. He understood, as all nobles of his era understood, that to defy the Pope was to invite catastrophe. But how to undo the marriage? Canon law required grounds. A marriage could be dissolved if it could be proven that an impediment had existed from the beginning. If, for instance, a prior betrothal was discovered, or if the couple were too closely related, or if the marriage had never been consummated. Here the historical record becomes murky, shadowed by rumor and the particular salacious interest of chroniclers who saw in the Borgia family a kind of moral theatre. It was whispered, then written, then repeated and amplified, that Alexander VI had caused the marriage to be annulled on the grounds that Giovanni Sforza had been unable to consummate it, that is to say, that the man was impotent. This claim appeared in contemporary documents, though whether it represented what was actually argued in the ecclesiastical proceedings, or whether it was instead a slur invented or embellished by observers, is difficult now to determine. Giovanni Sforza himself, in a letter composed years later, protested vehemently against this accusation. He insisted that he had been perfectly capable of fathering children, that he had in fact attempted to consummate the marriage with Lucrezia many times, and that the annulment had been forced upon him through the exercise of papal power and threat. Yet from Sforza's own protestations, and here we must pause to consider how evidence speaks through absence, and through the echoes of anger, we can infer that something troubling had occurred. A man does not spend years protesting his virility in writing unless he has been publicly humiliated by accusations that his virility was in question. So perhaps the impotence claim was genuine, perhaps it was fabricated, perhaps the truth lay somewhere in the murky territory between, where a young girl and a middle-aged man, caught in a political arrangement, found themselves unable to function as a married couple for reasons both physical and psychological, and those reasons were then converted into legal language to serve papal ends. The annulment was granted in 1497. Lucrezia returned to Rome, and with her return came something far more troubling than the simple fact of a dissolved marriage. A darker rumour began to circulate through the courts and salons of Italy, whispered in corridors and written in cautious language in private letters. It was suggested, carefully, obliquely, in the manner of accusations that were too dangerous to state openly, that Lucrezia's virginity at the time of the marriage might have been questionable, that her relationship with her father, the Pope, might have involved something beyond parental affection, that perhaps this was why Giovanni Sforza could not or would not consummate the marriage, that perhaps the accusation hangs in the historical record like smoke. We must be careful here, and we must be clear. There is no credible historical evidence that incest occurred between Alexander VI and his daughter. What we do know is that the rumour existed, that it was circulated by enemies of the Borgia family, that it was recorded in the dispatches of ambassadors who heard it second-hand, and that it attached itself to Lucrezia's name with the persistence of a shadow that no amount of light could fully dispel. The rumour tells us something, certainly. It tells us about the viciousness of Renaissance court politics, about how a woman's reputation could be weaponized, about how a father's excessive affection for a daughter could be reinterpreted through the lens of malice into something monstrous. But the rumour also obscures. It makes it nearly impossible now, 500 years later, to see Lucrezia clearly. Every historical account must pause and address this accusation, must deny it or qualify it, and in doing so, the accusation becomes the frame through which she is viewed. She is forever marked by what was whispered about her, forever shadowed by a rumour that probably says more about the observers and the enemies of her family than it says about her actual life. What we can say with confidence is this: the annulment happened. The marriage to Giovanni Sforza was dissolved through the exercise of papal authority. Lucrezia, barely 18 years old, found herself unmarried again, her first marriage erased from the ecclesiastical record as though it had never been, and she found herself burdened with a reputation that would follow her for the rest of her life, one that historians have spent centuries trying to either confirm or refute, and in the process, perhaps, have made it impossible ever to know the truth. The real Lucrezia, the actual woman who lived through these events, has been buried under layers of legend and defense, and counter-legend, lost beneath the weight of her family's crimes and of the crimes that were invented and attributed to her. In the spring of 1497, on a night when the Tiber ran dark beneath a moonless sky, Juan Borgia vanished from the streets of Rome. He was the Duke of Gandia, second son of Pope Alexander VI, a man in his mid-20s with a captain's bearing, and by all accounts, an uncomplicated temperament. He had spent the evening at his mother's house, where Vanozza dei Catane kept a household that was no longer entirely hidden, no longer entirely secret, but existed in that peculiar half-light of accepted illegitimacy that only the children of popes could inhabit. When Juan left that dwelling, he carried with him the weight of his father's ambitions and the fragile certainty of youth. He rode through Rome's narrow streets with a small group of attendants, heading toward the Piazza delle Corregge, where one of his mistresses kept a home. The streets were quiet. The city that had grown accustomed to the Borgia presence, that sprawling, ever-hungrier presence, settled into the rhythms of a spring night, and somewhere in those corridors of stone and shadow, Juan Borgia ceased to be findable. The next morning, when he did not return, a search began. It was methodical at first, then increasingly urgent. One does not simply lose a duke, the son of the reigning pope, without consequence. Servants were questioned, neighbors recalled seeing him pass. But Juan himself had slipped, like a figure in a dream, beyond the reach of certainty. 2 days later, his body was found, weighted down in the river, caught against the piers beneath the Ponte Sisto. He had been stabbed multiple times. His purse was untouched. His ring remained on his finger. Whatever had happened in those hours between the piazza and the water, it had not been simple robbery, and it had not been merciful. The death of Juan Borgia fractured something inside the papacy. Alexander VI, that man of such controlled appetites and calculated moves, wept openly. He ordered investigations. He offered rewards for information. He imposed a penance upon himself, walking barefoot through the halls of the Vatican in genuine grief and what observers recorded as sincere spiritual turmoil. This was not the theatrical piety of a pope managing his image. This was a father who had lost a son, and Rome, which had grown accustomed to the Borgias as instruments of ambition rather than vessels of human feeling, witnessed something rawer. Suspicion, however, does not wait for certainty to take root. Within the narrow circles of power that surrounded the Vatican, within the whispered conversations of cardinals and nobles, a name began to surface with increasing frequency: Cesare, Juan's older brother, the cardinal with the restless intelligence, the one who had never quite accepted his placement in the church, who moved through Rome with a hunger for something larger than a red hat could contain. And here, in this moment of family fracture and unresolved violence, began one of history's most persistent and ultimately unresolvable questions. Had Cesare killed his own brother? The logic that suggested this was seductive, almost inevitable in its construction. Cesare had long chafed against his ecclesiastical constraints. He had wanted military power, secular dominion, the kind of authority that the church could not grant to a cardinal who still wore his robes. Juan, meanwhile, existed as the chosen vessel for those ambitions that Cesare could not himself pursue. Alexander had favored Juan for the military ventures that were beginning to consume papal attention, for the captaincies and campaigns that might expand Borgia influence through the Romagna and beyond. If Cesare could not have those opportunities, the logic went, perhaps he could remove the one who did. And yet, and this is where the historical record becomes deliberately obscure, where certainty gives way to probability, and probability yields to shadow, there was no definitive evidence, no confession exists, no reliable witness came forward with testimony that withstood later scrutiny. Cesare himself, when questioned by his father, denied the charge with what contemporaries described as appropriate outrage, whether that outrage was the genuine fury of an innocent man or the practiced performance of a man who had learned to wear his face like a mask, remains unknowable across the centuries. What we know is this: there were other suspects. Juan's lifestyle, for all its protected status, had created enemies. He had taken a mistress from a noble family, and the seductions and abandonments that followed left rivals nursing their grievances. The streets of Rome were dangerous for anyone, even the son of a pope. Robbery that had gone wrong, murder in the course of theft, a settling of personal scores that had nothing to do with the higher intrigues of the Borgia household. These were plausible narratives, explanations that required no grand conspiracy, no fratricide born of jealousy and ambition, and perhaps that is what it was. Yet for contemporaries observing the Borgias in those years, Historians, diplomats, priests, courtiers, the suspicion lingered like incense smoke in a cathedral, impossible to entirely dispel. Cesare's behavior in the months that followed did little to quiet the whispers. He grew restless, more openly frustrated with his ecclesiastical constraints. Within 2 years of Juan's death, he would resign his cardinalate entirely, a move that had seemed unthinkable before, but which, in the aftermath of his brother's mysterious end, took on a different character. Was it ambition finally breaking free, or was it a son seeking to consolidate his position before his aging father's death? Or was it something more complex still, a man changing the trajectory of his own life in the wake of an act that, whether he had committed it or not, had cleared his path forward? The Borgia family, in its way, kept its secrets. If Cesare had ordered the death, if he had arranged it through intermediaries, the way men of power sometimes do, there would be little reason for the knowledge to escape those intimate circles of conspiracy. And if he had not, if he was innocent of this particular crime, then his silence on the matter might have sprung from something equally human, the burden of suspicion falling on him, the weight of a brother's blood that could not be washed away merely by declaring his innocence. What remains, across 5 centuries, is a vacuum where certainty should be. Juan Borgia lies in the Tiber, forever a young man, forever in the moment of his greatest ambition, forever unexplained. His death opened a door that his brother Cesare would walk through, and that passage, whether it was made by murder or merely by circumstance, would send ripples across all of Cesare's later years, colouring everything he did with the faint shadow of suspicion, the possibility that the greatest power he would ever wield had been purchased with the blood of his own kin. The truth, if it existed, died with the men who knew it. By the time Cesare Borgia reached his 30s, he had already shed the vestments of the church, like a serpent leaving behind its skin, the cardinal's robes, the red hat, the formal titles that had once bound him to the altar. All of it lay discarded in the wake of ambition. What remained was something far more dangerous, a prince without the restraint of faith, a military commander without the weight of religious obligation, a man armed with both the treasury of the Papal States and the blank moral canvas that allowed him to imagine an entirely new order across the fragmented landscape of central Italy. The Romagna was his canvas. This region, a sprawling collection of small duchies, lordships, and city-states that stretched from the Apennine Mountains toward the Adriatic coast, had never known true unity. Faenza held by one family, Pesaro by another, Rimini by a third, each town governed by petty despots, each lord preoccupied with his own survival against the schemes of his neighbours. For Cesare, watching from Rome with his father's resources behind him, this fragmentation was not a problem to be mourned, but an opportunity to be seized. Where others saw chaos, he perceived the raw material of a principality that could be his alone. In the winter of 1499, Cesare led his first substantial military campaign northward from Rome. The papal armies moved slowly at first, not because they lacked strength, but because speed was never the intention. This was theatre as much as conquest. The walls of each besieged city were meant to witness the banners approaching, to hear the rumours spreading from town to town, to see the soldiers gathering in such overwhelming numbers that resistance seemed not merely futile, but almost absurd. Imola fell within weeks. Forli followed. The tyrants who had ruled these places for generations were swept away or captured, their titles rendered meaningless, their private armies absorbed or disbanded. What had taken others lifetimes to acquire, Cesare was assembling in seasons. Yet Cesare understood something that distinguished him from mere military adventurers who came before. Raw conquest was temporary. A city conquered by force alone could revolt the moment that force turned its attention elsewhere. A lord driven from his palace by superior armies could gather loyal followers in exile and wait for the wheel to turn, as wheels always did. True power required something more subtle, more permanent. It required the appearance of legitimacy, the semblance of law, the construction of fear so rational and so carefully calibrated that submission seemed safer than resistance. In short, it required reputation. And reputation, Cesare grasped with almost prescient clarity, was built as much through the written word as through the cannon's mouth. This is where Niccolò Machiavelli enters the scene, drawn into proximity with Cesare not through choice, but through the machinery of Florentine diplomacy. Florence, Cesare's father's ally and Cesare's rival simultaneously, had sent Machiavelli north as a kind of observer, a man tasked with understanding what this new prince was actually doing, what his true ambitions might be, whether Florence should fear him or seek accommodation with him. Machiavelli was in his 30s then, still relatively obscure, a minor official with an excellent mind for detail and a gift for seeing through the performances that men staged for one another. He was not a chronicler commissioned to flatter, nor a military theorist hired to justify campaigns already won. He was simply a man watching, writing, thinking, trying to understand a figure who seemed to operate according to principles that did not quite fit the inherited rules of Italian politics. The letters Machiavelli wrote during those months observing Cesare are extraordinary documents. They capture not merely the events of conquest, but the philosophy underlying them. He noted how Cesare moved swiftly when speed served him, yet how he would pause deliberately if delay created uncertainty in his enemies. He observed how Cesare was capable of cruelty, truly terrible cruelty, yet how that cruelty was never random, never indulgent, never wasteful. It was always, Machiavelli perceived, the cruelty of calculation. A duke who resisted too stubbornly might be slaughtered as a warning to others. A captain who proved unreliable might be executed in the town square, where his soldiers could witness it. But a lord who surrendered gracefully, who bent the knee with dignity preserved, might find himself retained as a subordinate administrator, his lands intact, his family secure. Clemency and terror both, wielded with such precision that they became almost artistic. What Machiavelli was witnessing, though perhaps he did not fully understand it in the moment, was the birth of something genuinely new in Italian statecraft. The old order had been dominated by families with centuries of inheritance behind them, by merchant republics that governed through councils and consensus, by military adventurers, condottieri, who fought for whoever paid them most generously. Cesare represented something else entirely, a prince constructed almost deliberately, a state built not from tradition but from will, from strategy, from the cold calculation of force and its alternatives. He was, in essence, the first modern political animal that Italy had produced, and Machiavelli was one of the few minds acute enough to recognize it as it unfolded. The campaigns continued through 1500 and into 1501. Pesaro surrendered. Its lord, Giovanni Sforza, chose exile rather than face the Borgia armies, and his departure was so sudden, so complete, that the city fell almost without bloodshed. Rimini opened its gates. Cesare moved with his court, his soldiers, his musicians and advisors through the conquered territories, receiving the submission of lords, redistributing titles and authority, establishing what might almost be called an administration. In each city, he left behind capable men, not relatives. Cesare was too shrewd to rely solely on blood, but rather military officers and bureaucrats, chosen for their competence and their loyalty to him alone. These men were given clear authority and, more importantly, clear permission to act as needed. They were also given to understand that disloyalty, that any failure of purpose, would result in swift recall and harsh consequences. There is a quality of almost modern ruthlessness in the way Cesare approached these matters. A condottiero in his service named Ramiro de Orco, a man who had proven invaluable in breaking the resistance of the Romagnol lords, accumulated such personal power that he began to overshadow his master. His men feared him, certainly, but they also respected him independently of Cesare's authority. In 1502, Cesare recognized the danger this represented. He had de Orco arrested, tried, convicted, and then executed in a public square in Cesena. But this was no mere removal of a rival. The body was left for days in the piazza, displayed as a warning. The message was clear. Even Cesare's most valued servants would not be permitted to accumulate independent power. Authority flowed from him alone. Everything else was contingent, temporary, revocable. This act, the public execution of Ramiro de Orco, crystallized something for Machiavelli and others observing Cesare. It demonstrated a principle that would eventually become central to Machiavelli's own famous work, written years later, that a prince must sometimes commit acts of seeming cruelty to establish the order necessary for peace and prosperity. De Orco's death was terrible, brutal, unforgettable. Yet it also meant that in the territories he governed afterward, there was less arbitrary violence, less factional warfare among local nobles, less general chaos. Machiavelli understood this paradox intimately. He also understood that Cesare understood it, that this was not the action of a man driven by rage or temperament, but the calculated move of someone who had thought through the consequences and judged them acceptable. By 1502, Cesare had consolidated control over much of the Romagna. In a very real sense, he had created something that resembled a state, unified under a single authority, governed by recognizable laws and administered by a functioning bureaucracy. It was a remarkable achievement for so young a man, made still more remarkable by the fact that it had been accomplished in such a short span of time. Yet even as Cesare stood at what appeared to be the apex of his power, the foundations upon which everything rested were beginning to shift in ways that he could not entirely control. The balance of power in Italian politics was never stable. Alliances shifted with each new marriage, each death, each shift in the temperament of kings and popes. France and Spain, the two great powers that dominated European affairs, were both invested in Italian politics, both seeking advantage, both moving their pieces across the board with long-term strategy in mind. Cesare had his father's support, which was considerable, but that support was as contingent as everything else in Renaissance politics. Alexander VI was aging. Everyone knew it. When he died, and death comes to popes as to all men, Cesare's world would change overnight. The cardinals would gather, they would elect a new pope, and that pope would have no reason whatsoever to favor the ambitious son of his predecessor. And yet, in the meantime, what a figure Cesare had become. Across Europe, he was spoken of with a mixture of admiration and dread. He had proven that a prince with intelligence, resources, and absolute ruthlessness could reshape the political landscape. He had shown that the old families, the hereditary nobles who had governed for generations, were not invincible. He had demonstrated that a man of sufficient will could establish himself as the equal of kings and dukes who could claim centuries of inheritance behind them. This reputation, this carefully cultivated image of a calculating, merciless, yet also effective and intelligent leader, would become his most enduring legacy, even after everything else had been taken from him. And it would haunt Machiavelli, haunt historians, haunt anyone who tried to understand the nature of power in the world as it actually existed rather than as moral philosophy suggested it should be. There exists, in the dim corridors of Renaissance memory, a substance so feared, so whispered about in the Italian courts and the drawing rooms of Europe, that it became almost inseparable from the very name Borgia, poison. The word itself carried a kind of sinister music, something that moved through conversation like smoke, impossible to grasp, impossible to dismiss. And yet, as we sit with the historical record, allowing it to settle into the quiet spaces of our understanding, we find something far more intricate than the lurid tales that would come to define a family for centuries. The truth is that poison, in the 15th and 16th centuries, was neither invention nor scandal exclusive to any single dynasty. It was, in fact, an instrument of statecraft, as common as diplomacy itself. In a world where assassination removed inconvenient rivals, and where the sudden death of an opponent could shift the balance of entire kingdoms, poison represented something almost rational, a means of control that required no army, no declaration, no witnesses. And so when the Borgias rose to prominence, when they accumulated power with a speed that seemed almost supernatural to their contemporaries, suspicion naturally gathered around them like fog. Let us begin with what we know with certainty. There are deaths whose circumstances we can trace, whose medical nature we can attempt to understand through the lens of what we know today about disease and time. Juan Borgia, the favoured son of Alexander VI, disappeared into the Tiber in 1497. His body, when recovered, bore signs of violence. Stab wounds, the reports tell us. There is no poison here, only the blade. And yet the rumours began almost immediately. Had Cesare arranged this murder, and if so, how? With poison that worked swiftly, that left no trace. The story became more elaborate with each retelling. Each whispered conversation added a layer of intrigue, until the simple fact of a young man's corpse in dark water transformed into an opera of suspicion. What we must understand is that the death of Juan Borgia served a narrative function far more powerful than any actual poison could have achieved. It removed from Cesare's path the heir favoured by their father. It left Cesare, the ambitious cardinal-turned-prince, as the inheritor of Alexander's ambitions for Borgia power in the secular world. And so the question of poison became almost irrelevant to the historical moment. The death itself, regardless of its cause, had already accomplished what suspicion needed it to accomplish. Consider, too, the nature of death itself in that era. The 16th century was intimately acquainted with plague, with fever, with the sudden illnesses that could fell a cardinal or a duke within days or even hours. Tuberculosis moved silently through the great households. Malaria haunted the marshlands surrounding Rome. Dysentery, that ordinary horror of poor sanitation, killed as efficiently as any assassin's hand. And yet when a member of the Borgia family died, especially when that death was sudden or unexpected, there arose an almost reflexive impulse to attribute it to poison. The family had become, in the popular imagination, so thoroughly associated with intrigue and ruthlessness that any death within their orbit seemed to cry out for a darker explanation than mere disease. The legend of the Borgia poison, in particular, acquired almost mythological status. It was said to be so refined, so cunningly devised, that it could be administered in the form of a ring that would scratch the skin and deliver death with no antidote, no cure, no possible escape. Or it came as powder, invisible, tasteless, odorless, mixed into wine or food with such perfect precision that the victim would never know they were dying until already dead. These tales circulated through Europe like a dark fairy tale. Rulers grew cautious. Ambassadors tasted their food before their princes would eat. The very possibility of Borgia poison became more dangerous than poison itself. And yet, here is where we must pause and breathe with the weight of this. There is virtually no documentary evidence that the Borgias possessed any special knowledge of poison, or any exclusive access to poisonous substances, or indeed that they employed poison with any particular frequency or expertise. The legend far outstrips the record. The historical sources that do speak to possible poisonings are vague, often reliant on rumor or the reports of enemies who had every reason to blacken the Borgia name. Consider the deaths of Alexander VI himself, in the year 1503. He died of a fever. The attending physicians described the illness as something that seemed to strike him suddenly, that ravaged his body with heat and delirium. Was it poison? Some contemporaries certainly believed so. Some modern scholars have speculated about the possibility. But what do we actually have? A description of symptoms consistent with any number of illnesses common to the time. Malaria, which plagued Rome regularly, would have presented much as this death presented itself. A gastric illness contracted from contaminated food or water. An infection that modern antibiotics could have easily treated, but which, in that era, could rage unchecked through the body until it consumed the victim entirely. The human mind, we might reflect, seems drawn to explanations that feel equal to the magnitude of events. If a man dies, there must have been a reason proportional to his importance. If a great family rises to power, there must be secrets dark enough to match their ascent. A cardinal might simply succumb to fever, but that seems somehow insufficient. The death must be deliberate. It must be orchestrated. It must be worthy of the family's fearsome reputation, and so legend is born from the gap between what happened and what seems as though it ought to have happened. There are, we should note, a few documented cases where poison seems to have played a role in the Borgia orbit. A bishop here, an inconvenient enemy there. Cases where the circumstances do suggest something more sinister than natural disease. But even these are few, and even they rest on foundations of inference rather than absolute proof. We are reading signs from centuries away, attempting to diagnose illness and death with only the bluntest of instruments. What becomes clear as we rest with this history is that the Borgia reputation for poisoning served a purpose far more potent than actual poisoning ever could. It was a kind of power in itself, a darkness that preceded them into rooms, that made enemies hesitate, that allowed them to accomplish through fear what they might not have needed to accomplish through force. The legend became the weapon, and in that transformation, something curious happened. The family, that had been ruthless and ambitious in ways we can document, became, in the popular imagination, almost supernaturally sinister in ways we cannot. The last reflection we might offer as we move deeper into the quietness of this history is this. The poison of the Borgias may have been less about any actual substance than about their emergence at a particular moment in history, when the old structures of authority were crumbling and new forms of power were taking shape. They were ambitious in an era that had grown suspicious of ambition. They were practical in an age yearning for moral clarity. They wielded power in ways that seemed to violate the rules of the game as contemporaries understood them, and so they were painted with every sin that an era's imagination could conjure. The poison, perhaps, was the metaphor rather than the method. The year was 1498, when Lucrezia Borgia, still burdened by the whispers that followed her name like shadows through Roman corridors, found herself bound once more to marriage. But this time, the union would carry her far from the suffocating intrigue of the papal court. Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, had accepted her hand, though not without considerable reluctance. His family, the House of Este, stood among the most powerful dynasties of northern Italy, a line so ancient and respected that they looked upon the Borgias as climbers, as those who had purchased their way into nobility rather than inherited it. Yet Alfonso needed what the Pope could offer: military support, territorial advantage, a shield against the ambitions of Venice and Milan. And so Lucrezia, at the age of 21, travelled northward through the rolling landscape of Emilia-Romagna, leaving behind the marble vastness of Rome for the brick-red beauty of Ferrara, a city built upon water and guarded by walls that had witnessed centuries of quiet power. What she discovered there was not the cold rejection she may have feared, but something far more complex. The Deste court was a sanctuary of learning, a place where Renaissance beauty had taken root as deeply as it had in Florence or Venice. Her new husband, Alfonso, was no lover of women. His true passions lay in the cannon foundries of his duchy, in the engineering of warfare and the casting of bronze. Yet he was not unkind to her. He had his own beloved, a mistress named Laura, and he made no pretense of romantic attachment. This arrangement, so foreign to the great European courts of sentiment and courtship, freed Lucrezia in ways she had scarcely imagined possible. For the first time in her life, she could exist without performing the elaborate dance of feminine compliance that Rome had demanded of her. She could breathe. The Duchess of Ferrara, as she became known, proved to have gifts that had been obscured beneath the layers of scandal and suspicion. She moved through the palatial rooms of the Este castle with a musician's grace, for she had been trained in song and instrument from childhood. She knew Latin and Italian, Spanish and French, a linguistic fluency that made her invaluable as a cultural figure in a court that prided itself on learning. And most surprisingly, she revealed an almost scholarly inclination, a hunger for books and knowledge that her upbringing in the papal household had nurtured far more than anyone in Rome had bothered to acknowledge. The great libraries of Ferrara opened to her, and she began to frequent them with genuine passion. It was during these years that the true Lucrezia emerged, or perhaps one could say that the woman her circumstances had always allowed her to become finally had permission to exist openly. She surrounded herself with artists and poets, with scholars and musicians. The Deste court had long been a patron of the arts. Isabella d'Este, Alfonso's sister, was herself a legendary collector and cultivator of genius, known throughout Italy for her discerning eye and her willingness to support innovation in painting, sculpture, and literature. Lucrezia, following in her sister-in-law's wake but carving her own quieter path, became a generous patroness in her turn. The painter Giovanni Boccaccio found in her a thoughtful and engaged beneficiary. The poet Pietro Bembo, whose elegant verses had circulated through every court of Italy, came to Ferrara and found in the Duchess a woman of genuine intellectual companionship. One might wonder what drew such luminaries to the company of a woman whose name had been dragged through every scandalous rumor Rome could manufacture. The answer, perhaps, was that they recognized what Rome had been too distracted to see, that Lucrezia Borgia possessed a mind of real distinction, unmarred by the intrigues that had shadowed her early life, and in the gardens of Ferrara, beneath the gentle climate of the northern Adriatic region, she could finally be known for herself. Her patronage was never the most extravagant in Italy. That distinction belonged surely to Isabella d'Este and the great Medici family, but it was earnest and carefully considered. She did not simply purchase art as a display of wealth, as so many nobles did. She collected manuscripts with the care of a scholar, supported musicians with genuine attention to their craft, and created an environment where learning could flourish in a city that was already known for its humanist traditions. The University of Ferrara benefited from her attention, and she became known among scholars as someone who understood the fragile ecosystem of intellectual life, the way that patronage must balance generosity with respect for the minds it supports. In the ducal chamber, she bore Alfonso 3 children, Alfonso, Ippolito, and Francesco, providing the d'Este line with heirs and securing her position as duchess. Her son Alfonso would grow to manhood in Ferrara and become duke in his turn, carrying forward the legacy of the house with none of the taint that had pursued his mother. The d'Este family, which had initially viewed her as a liability, came gradually to regard her as an asset, a woman whose quiet competence and cultural cultivation added luster to their court. Alfonso himself, though distant, grew to respect her, and that respect, though it fell far short of love, was perhaps more valuable than romantic affection would have been. There is a poignant quality to considering Lucrezia in these middle years of her life. Settled in Ferrara, her reputation slowly undergoing the first subtle processes of rehabilitation. The terrible rumors that had clung to her in Rome, the whispers of her father's incestuous affection, the accusations of poisoning, the vague implications of unwomanly knowledge and unnatural influence, all of these seemed to diminish in the distance from the papal court. Distance, one might note, has always been a kind of mercy for the reputations of the powerful. And yet Lucrezia did not simply fade into obscurity and allow her past to be forgotten. Instead, she wove a new identity into the fabric of Ferrara, one thread at a time, through the support she offered to artists, through the tone she set in court, through the simple act of being present and competent and engaged with the intellectual life of her duchy. The chroniclers who visited Ferrara and left accounts of the court in these years often noted her with surprise. They had come expecting to find a woman of notorious character, and instead they encountered someone composed, learned, dignified. The discrepancy between the legend and the reality must have been jarring. Some whispered that Ferrara had reformed her, that the distance from Rome had purged her of whatever wickedness had poisoned her youth. Others, more skeptical, wondered if perhaps the legend had been exaggerated all along, if the Rome that created the myth of Lucrezia Borgia had been more interested in scandal than in truth. It is a question that lingers, even now, across the centuries. What is the true measure of a person whose early life has been so thoroughly mythologized that the boundary between documented fact and imaginative embellishment becomes almost impossible to perceive? For the listener drifting through these old corridors of history, perhaps the answer matters less than the simple observation that in Ferrara, in those quiet years, Lucrezia Borgia found a kind of peace. She became not a saint. Such transformations are the province of religious legend, not historical accuracy, but rather a woman of genuine accomplishment, a patron of learning, a mother, a duchess. The woman who had been defined by her relationships to powerful men, her father, her husbands, her brother, found in Ferrara a space in which to define herself. The year approaches 1493, and in the marble chambers of the Vatican, Pope Alexander VI still draws breath, still signs decrees, still commands the resources of Christendom. His son Cesare, now in his late 20s, has consolidated power across the Romagna with a methodical cruelty that draws both fear and a kind of reluctant admiration from the surviving lords of the region. Lucrezia, settled now in Ferrara as duchess, maintains her position through grace and careful silence. The Borgia ascendancy seems almost permanent, almost inevitable, as though the family had always occupied these heights and would occupy them forever. But permanence, as history so often teaches us in whispers, is an illusion that dissolves the moment we cease to sustain it. In the early days of August 1493, Pope Alexander VI fell ill. The records tell us it was likely malaria, that fever which crept up from the marshes around Rome each summer and took no account of purple silk or papal authority. The Pope's condition worsened with a speed that alarmed his physicians and his children. Cesare maintained a vigil at his father's bedside, watching the old man's breathing grow more labored, his skin take on the grey pallor of advancing age and sickness. On the 18th of August, Alexander VI died. He was 72 years old. He had occupied the throne of St. Peter for more than a decade, and in that single moment of his passing, everything the Borgias had constructed, every alliance, every appointment, every cardinal placed strategically within the college, every promise whispered in darkened corridors, stood upon ground that was suddenly shifting beneath it. The conclave that followed Alexander's death opened just days after his burial. The College of Cardinals gathered in the Sistine Chapel to elect a new pope, and Cesare Borgia, for the first time in his adult life, found himself without the instrument that had shaped his power. His father's authority, vast as it had been, could not pass to him as an inheritance. A pope's children could inherit wealth, titles, perhaps some measure of influence, but not the papacy itself. The cardinals who had bent before Alexander's will now remembered that they owed him nothing, and among them was a figure whose ambition burned as fiercely as any Borgia's, Giuliano della Rovere, the man who would become Pope Julius II. Della Rovere had never forgiven the Borgias. Years earlier, during Alexander's papacy, he had fled Rome, forced into exile by the machinations of papal politics, his enemies ascendant, his influence diminished. He had spent those years in the courts of France and elsewhere, nursing his resentment, plotting his return. Now, with Alexander dead, the moment had arrived. The cardinals chose Della Rovere to be pope. He took the name Julius II, and though he was an old man himself, nearly 60, the fire in him burned with singular intensity. Where Alexander had been a pragmatist, willing to negotiate and compromise with the great powers of Europe, Julius II was a warrior pope, restless and determined to strip the church clean of the corruption he associated, perhaps not without reason, with the Borgias. Within weeks of Julius's election, the landscape had transformed. Cesare found his position eroding with a swiftness that must have seemed almost dreamlike in its rapidity. The offices he held in Rome, the influence he wielded, the fear his name inspired, all of it evaporated like morning dew. Julius II began to move against him openly. The new pope demanded that Cesare surrender the territories he had conquered in the Romagna, demand them back to papal control, though of course papal control in this instance meant control exercised by the Pope himself, not by the Borgias. Cesare, who had ruled through military strength, found that strength suddenly insufficient. The armies he had assembled, the captains he had paid, the fortresses he had garrisoned, these things required money, and money was something he no longer had. His father's vast wealth, which he had inherited, was insufficient to maintain his position against the combined pressure of a hostile pope and the shifting alliances of Italian politics. There exists a curious moment in the documentary evidence of this collapse. Some chroniclers record that Julius II actually invited Cesare to Rome, promised him safe conduct, perhaps even offered him a reconciliation of sorts. Cesare, trusting or desperate or both, accepted the invitation. He made his way back to the city where he had been so feared, and once inside the walls, the safe conduct apparently evaporated. He was arrested, imprisoned, his movements controlled. What happened to him in captivity remains obscure. The historical record grows clouded here, as it so often does when powerful men have reasons to conceal what has transpired. Some accounts suggest torture. Others propose a quieter kind of coercion. We might wonder whether Julius, so eager to erase the Borgia influence, saw fit to brutalize the man who had embodied it most completely, or whether Cesare's imprisonment was merely a pragmatic tool to strip him of his remaining power. What is clear is that Cesare remained a prisoner, held first in Rome, then transferred to other fortresses as the Pope deemed necessary. His situation grew steadily worse. The fortresses he had controlled in the Romagna, that network of strongholds which had been the foundation of his secular principality, fell one by one. Some submitted to Julius's authority because the Pope was now the sovereign lord, and they had no reason to resist him. Others were won over through negotiation or the application of force. The domain that Cesare had assembled through military genius and ruthless calculation simply dissolved. It is difficult not to observe a certain symmetry here. What had been built through violence and the projection of will could not withstand the violence and will of a pope far older and far more implacable than Cesare had anticipated. Did he, lying in his cell, understand that his father's death had been the pivot upon which everything turned? That without Alexander's patronage, without the papal authority that elevated him above the normal rules of statecraft and succession, his accomplishments had been written, as it were, in water? In early 1495, Cesare managed his escape. The precise details are again obscure, clouded by time and the reticence of those who might have facilitated his flight. He made his way southward, eventually reaching the coast, seeking passage by ship. He fled Italy itself, his dominion lost, his power dissipated, seeking refuge in Spain, in the court of his father's relatives, the Spanish nobility from whom the Borgias had originally arisen. He would never see Italy again, never reclaim the lands he had conquered, never restore himself to the position of power that had seemed so assured just months before. The speed of this reversal carries a weight that settles quietly into reflection. In the space of perhaps 3 years, Cesare Borgia had fallen from being one of the most powerful figures in all of Europe, a man whose name was whispered with fear in the councils of kings and cardinals, to an exile and a fugitive, dependent upon the charity of Spanish relatives who perhaps remembered him as a fallen prince but could not restore what he had lost. Power, it seems, is not truly inherited in any reliable sense. It cannot be accumulated like gold and stored safely away for future use. It must be continuously recreated, continuously sustained, continuously performed. The moment the force that maintains it ceases, a pope's death, a rival's ascent, it collapses with a speed that seems almost too swift to credit. The man who had once commanded armies from the Adriatic to the heart of the Italian peninsula found himself, as the 16th century's second decade began, stripped of title and territory in a matter of months. When Pope Julius II ascended to the throne in 1503, the Borgia era did not simply end, it evaporated, like morning mist over the Tiber. Cesare, who had believed himself unassailable through cunning and force, discovered that neither shield nor sword could protect him from the machinery of Rome itself when that machinery turned away. He was arrested, imprisoned in the Castel Sant'Angelo, and held in such darkness that contemporaries whispered he had been forgotten in the depths of the fortress, a phantom locked away from the light. Yet even from confinement, Cesare's mind worked. He was, if nothing else, a survivor of extraordinary determination. Through careful negotiation and the quiet intervention of those who owed him favors or feared his memory, he secured his release in the summer of 1504. But release meant exile, not restoration. He could not remain in Italy, where every prince he had threatened, every lord he had displaced, every cardinal whose wealth he had coveted, was now free to pursue vengeance. So Cesare turned his gaze northward, across the Alps and towards Spain, where his family's roots still lay in Sativa, and where the court of King Ferdinand, his distant kinsman, offered at least the possibility of refuge, if not redemption. The journey north through the autumn of 1504 was not the triumphant march of a condottiero leading mercenaries toward conquest. It was the solitary pilgrimage of a fallen prince, moving through lands where his name, once synonymous with terror and ambition, was becoming merely a rumor, a cautionary tale whispered in the candlelit halls of noble houses. He moved deliberately, cautiously, gathering what remained of his fortune and his reputation around him like a tattered cloak. When he finally crossed the border into Castile, he was no longer the Duke of Valentinois, the Captain General of the Papal States, the man whom Niccolo Machiavelli had observed with such intense fascination. He was simply Cesare Borgia, a man in his late 20s, dispossessed and searching for a place in a world that no longer required his particular talents. King Ferdinand of Aragon welcomed him with the courtesy due to a distant relation, but also with the caution one might show toward a caged predator. Courteous, but from a safe distance. Cesare was given lands, modest lands, in the Kingdom of Navarre, and there he settled into a strange sort of domestic life. He married Charlotte d'Albret, a widow of considerable property and standing, and for a time it seemed as though he might genuinely attempt to transform himself into the role of a provincial nobleman, content with hunting and the management of estates rather than the orchestration of power through blood and bribes. But the transformation was never quite complete. Those who encountered him during these years noted that his eyes retained that calculating quality, that his conversation often turned toward military strategy and the positioning of forces, that he remained, in some essential way, the Prince of Romagna even when garbed in the simpler clothes of a frontier lord. The peace, such as it was, proved temporary. In 1506, a new opportunity seemed to present itself when King Ferdinand planned a military campaign in North Africa, and Cesare offered his services. Here, perhaps, he thought, was a chance to restore his reputation, to demonstrate once more his capabilities as a military commander. He joined the expedition against Mers el-Kebir with what must have been a strange mixture of hope and desperation. But the campaign itself was modest, almost provincial in its scale, and when a quarrel erupted between Cesare and a superior officer, he found himself, in an incident whose exact details remain obscure, injured, perhaps beaten, perhaps struck during a confrontation, and his standing further damaged. By 1507, Cesare had withdrawn to the relative obscurity of Viana, a small town in Navarre, where the king had granted him the position of royal viceroy, a title that carried administrative responsibility but little actual power. It was here, in this diminished circumstance, that the restless energy that had animated his youth finally began to falter. He lived quietly, managing the town's affairs with more or less competence, maintaining his marriage, and engaging in the mundane concerns of a provincial administrator. To observers of the time, and to those who would study him in later centuries, there was something almost unbearable about this transformation. The man who had stood in the Vatican, who had commissioned architects and artists, who had moved armies across the landscape of Italy itself, was now occupied with the collection of local taxes and the settling of disputes between merchants. On the 11th of March in 1507, a small military engagement erupted near Viana. The details are frustratingly vague in the historical record, lost to centuries, and the fact that those who might have witnessed it accurately were either dead or indifferent to recording such a minor skirmish with precision. What is known is that Cesare Borgia, the man who had orchestrated campaigns of such brutal sophistication, was killed in this obscure encounter. The manner of his death remains uncertain. Some accounts suggest he died fighting, engaged in direct combat with an enemy. Others propose he was murdered, killed by someone who recognized the fallen prince and seized the chance for revenge or glory. The truth, as is so often the case with history's most compelling mysteries, seems to lie somewhere in the space between legend and documentation, never quite retrievable, never quite certain. His body was buried in the church at Viana, and the news of his death, when it eventually travelled back to Rome and beyond, seemed almost anticlimactic, a small footnote to what he had been, a quiet ending to a life that had burned so brilliantly. Yet perhaps there was a strange grace in that obscurity, a mercy of sorts. Cesare had escaped the fate that so many of his contemporaries feared. He had not been imprisoned perpetually, had not been poisoned in a cardinal's palace, had not been dragged through the streets of Rome by an angry mob. He died, in the end, as a soldier might, far from the corridors of power, in a small town whose name would become forever linked with his fall. While Cesare was walking those quiet streets of Viana, slowly accepting the diminishment of his life, his sister Lucrezia had embarked on a remarkably different path. Where his fortune had contracted like a stone sinking in dark water, hers had, in certain respects, continued to rise. Her marriage to Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, had secured her a position of genuine prominence in one of Italy's greatest and most culturally refined courts. Ferrara, under the patronage of the Este family, was a city of artists and scholars, a place where humanism flourished and beauty was regarded not merely as ornament, but as a necessity of civilized existence. Here, Lucrezia found herself in a role that suited her, not as a pawn in her father's strategic games, not as a cardinalate to be withdrawn or bestowed, but as a duchess with real responsibilities and real agency in the governance of her adopted city. The woman who arrived in Ferrara in 1501 was 30 years old, no longer the young bride whose marriages had been negotiated by her father without her own voice carrying particular weight. She had learned, over the years, how to navigate the treacherous territories of court politics, how to cultivate relationships that were valuable, how to present herself in ways that were politically advantageous. The rumors that had followed her, the whispered accusations of impropriety with her father and her brother, did not entirely disappear, but in Ferrara they seemed to matter less. She was no longer the daughter of a pope, she was the Duchess of Este, and that identity, once established, was powerful enough to overshadow whatever shadows clung to her name. The historical record suggests that Lucrezia took her role as Duchess with genuine seriousness. She bore children to Alfonso, securing the Este succession. She involved herself in the patronage of artists and poets, building around her a court that became known for its intellectual sophistication. She corresponded with humanists and writers across Italy. And most remarkably, given the character she had been forced to play in Rome, she seems to have found a measure of genuine contentment in Ferrara. Not the contentment of power or of fear's absence, but something quieter and perhaps more durable, the contentment of being allowed, finally, to shape one's own life according to one's own choices. Yet even in Ferrara, the weight of her family's history never entirely lifted. Her father's death in 1503 had already diminished her authority and altered her relationship to the papal see. The fall of Cesare cast a longer shadow. Those who had known the height of Borgia power began to regard Lucrezia with a certain pity, not unkind, but evident nonetheless. She had escaped the catastrophe that had consumed her father and brother, but she had escaped into what amounts, by the standards of the Renaissance, to a kind of exile, however gilded that exile might be. In the early years of the 16th century, as Lucrezia settled into her life in Ferrara, the city itself became a sanctuary of sorts. She had lovers, most notably the poet Pietro Bembo, with whom she maintained a correspondence that historians have debated and analyzed for centuries. Was theirs a purely intellectual and emotional bond? Did it extend into physical intimacy? The records do not tell us explicitly, but the tone of their letters suggests a connection that was, at the very least, profound and romantic in nature. These letters, preserved and eventually published, offer us a glimpse of Lucrezia that no court record can provide, a woman of genuine sensibility and learning, capable of deep feeling, struggling to reconcile the person she had been forced to be with the person she might have wished to become. The years passed, the century turned. Lucrezia bore Alfonso children, and those children thrived. She aged, as all people do, and in aging she seems to have moved even further from the woman whose marriages had been orchestrated in papal rooms, whose reputation had been shadowed by scandal, whose life had been used as a tool in her father's grand design. She became a patron of convents and churches. She involved herself in charitable works. By the time she reached her middle years, She had constructed an identity in Ferrara that was authentic in ways that her earlier lives had not been, not corrupted by the need to survive through calculation, not burdened by the weight of being the daughter of Cannot. And so we arrive at the end of a dynasty that once seemed as permanent as the marble columns of St. Peter's Basilica itself. The Borgias held Rome, shaped nations, crowned and decrowned kings and queens, and yet within a generation, perhaps less, their power scattered like ash on the Tiber. It is one of history's most complete erasures, and perhaps that very completeness ought to tell us something about the nature of power itself. Think of how a name persists even as the thing it names dissolves. The word Borgia, even now, carries within it a weight of association, a kind of historical atmosphere that clings to anyone who bears it. Poison, incest, unbridled ambition, corruption absolute. And yet when we examine the evidence carefully, when we separate the documents from the gossip, when we distinguish between what was actually proven and what was whispered in shadowed rooms across Europe, the picture becomes far less certain. It becomes human, complicated, shaded by the biases of those who wrote about them in the aftermath of their fall. Consider Lucretia. For centuries, her name was nearly synonymous with depravity, with the very essence of Renaissance corruption. Historians and dramatists painted her as a woman of insatiable appetites, a vessel for her father's and brother's darkest schemes. Yet the documents that survived suggest something more nuanced. We find letters written in her hand. We discover records of her patronage, her genuine interest in learning and the arts. We learn that in Ferrara, in her later years, she was remembered by those who knew her as dignified, as devout even, and as a woman who bore the weight of having been used as a pawn in her family's relentless march toward power. Perhaps we shall never know the whole truth of her inner life. Perhaps no one ever truly does. But the gap between myth and probability is itself instructive. Cesare is even more curious in this regard. He possessed genuine military talent, genuine administrative vision. He studied fortifications and strategy with an intensity that suggests a mind genuinely engaged with the practical challenges of rule. And yet his reputation as a calculating prince, a man of Machiavellian ruthlessness, may itself be partly constructed, a narrative that later observers built upon fragments of fact, upon his known alliances and known rivals and his known ambition, what is true and what is embellished. We may never be entirely certain. History rarely offers us certainty. It offers us archives and inference, and the slow accumulation of probability. There is something almost melancholy about studying the Borgias in this way, isn't there? Because it means relinquishing the comfort of a clean story. We cannot simply say they were demons or saints, blackguards or visionaries. They were, in the end, a family operating within the constraints and possibilities of their time, wielding the tools available to them: wealth, familial connection, ecclesiastical authority, military force, marriage alliances, strategic betrayal. They did what people with power have always done. They sought more of it. They protected it. They tried to ensure that their children would inherit it. And when it slipped away, when Pope Julius II refused to tolerate what Alexander VI had so laboriously built, the dynasty crumbled with surprising speed. What becomes of power once it has gone? Where does it reside in the memory of a place? Rome, of course, continued. The papal states continued. The marble churches that Alexander built still stand. The fortifications that Cesare raised still mark the landscape of the Romagna. In this sense, their influence never truly vanished. It was absorbed into the fabric of the place itself, becoming so much a part of the landscape that we scarcely recognize it as Borgia anymore. But the living memory of them, the sense of who they actually were, that faded much faster. The Borgias became a legend almost immediately, a cautionary tale, a symbol of everything that critics of the Renaissance Church found most troubling. And perhaps there is an irony there. A family that grasped so urgently for immortality through power, through monuments, through the establishment of a dynasty that would endure, found instead that they were immortalized primarily through rumor and suspicion, and the stories told about them by their enemies, and by later moralists seeking to score a point. Their actual lives, the particular details of how Rodrigo thought, what Lucrezia felt, the precise calculations that moved Cesare from city to city, these receded behind the veil of legend so thoroughly that we cannot entirely recover them. This is perhaps the deepest mystery surrounding the Borgias, not whether they poisoned their rivals, though that question lingered for centuries, not whether incest darkened their family circle, though those whispers were constant, but rather what was lost when we stopped seeing them as people and began seeing them as symbols. What happened to the particular texture of their lives, the small moments that make up existence, when we transformed them into players in a morality tale about the dangers of ambition and corruption? The answer, of course, is that we cannot recover those things now. We have only documents and architecture and the shapes left behind by absence. We have the memory of a memory, 5 centuries distant, filtered through languages and translations and the ideologies of those who transcribed and preserved what they found important. We have probability and educated guessing. We have the long conversation that historians carry on with the past, knowing all the while that the past cannot answer back, cannot clarify or revise or contradict. And perhaps there is peace in accepting that. Perhaps there is something restful in the acknowledgement that some questions cannot be answered with the certainty we crave. The Borgias rose and fell. They were ambitious and calculating, and in their way, historically significant. They were also, almost certainly, a good deal more ordinary than their legend suggests, caught up in the same competitions for status and security and legacy that move all human beings, just with higher stakes and grander stages. They were at once extraordinary and thoroughly, recognizably human. The Rome they knew is gone now, replaced by centuries of change and rebuilding and reformation. The power structures they manipulated have transformed beyond recognition. The church they served has had 5 centuries of history since their time, long centuries in which the very institution they dominated has grappled with the question of how to reconcile spiritual authority with temporal power, the very question their rise so dramatically illustrated. In a sense, the Borgias are still asking their questions. We are still working through the problems that their lives posed. And so the story ends not with a resolution, but with a gentle dissolution. The family scattered, their power vanished like water soaking into stone. Their names, once whispered with fear in the halls of every European capital, became instead the substance of anecdote and legend. What remains is the trace they left on their time, the buildings, the documents, the marriages that created new dynasties, the political shifts they set in motion. What remains is also what we have created in our imagination, the narrative we have built around them, which is perhaps as much about us and our own preoccupations as it is about them. So we leave them there, in the history books and the ruins of their ambitions, in the fading light of Renaissance Rome. We leave them as they were, reaching always, grasping always, certain always that the next acquisition of power, the next advantageous marriage, the next ecclesiastical promotion would finally be enough. It never was, it never could have been, and in that endless reaching, in that fundamental hunger that power itself cannot satisfy, perhaps they are most recognizably one of us. The candles have burned down now in those shadowed corridors we began with. The voices of those long-dead men and women have faded beyond hearing. What remains is silence, and memory, and the gentle, patient work of forgetting, which is perhaps finally a mercy.